The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 326, Liar or Madman. Where is the slave castle? Friedrich had a certain knowledge of the major ports around the world, and even had defense maps of the major ports. Bagamoyo. The adjutant replied, "Point. If the other party is talking about the port of Bagamoyo, he will definitely react immediately. It is the second largest port in East Africa after Mombasa, located in Kenya, and was once a Portuguese colony. After changing hands several times, it is now in the hands of the Omanis. But the name Prisoner's Castle was more popular among businessmen, isn't that a free trade port between the Portuguese and the Dutch?" Friedrich asked a little strangely. After all, the Portuguese and the British wear the same pants. Moreover, the so-called free trade port is a mixed bag of dragons and snakes, with multiple forces entangled in it. Coupled with a slave trade center, taking it down will definitely arouse the dissatisfaction of the great powers. Yes. The adjutant replied affirmatively. Let him go. Yes, Friedrich and Franz had seen too many clowns like this together. They always thought that they were the chosen one and wanted nothing but nothing, and they did not weigh their own weight. Wait. Franz stopped the adjutant at this time. Franz, you don't really plan to attack Bagamoyo port. If you want to engage in slave trade, it is the largest slave trade center in East Africa. But if you just want a colony, there is really no need. Point. Now the expansion of the Austrian Empire has reached its limit, and the government has no money to invest in development. I know you are rich, but Bagamoyo is too far away from the Austrian mainland and difficult to rule. Friedrich knew very well that he would not touch his nephew, whether he was selling slaves or selling drugs. Therefore, Friedrich kept warning his officers along the way not to touch slaves and illegal goods, to avoid getting into trouble. Tanzania has strong indigenous alliances in the interior, and also faces threats from the Said dynasty of Oman to the north. At this time, the interior of Tanzania was still blank to Europeans, but the Portuguese had indeed been besieged by tens of thousands of indigenous people here, so it was generally believed that there was a powerful empire or tribal alliance within it. Uncle Friedrich, Bagamoyo is the second largest port in East Africa after Mombasa. If it can be captured, it will be very beneficial to the empire's future expansion. And I think the benefits far outweigh the costs. After all, Mombasa is already in the Arab sphere of influence. If we let the passing businessmen choose, I think they would definitely be more willing to do business with us. Okay. The adjutant asked the guy to come up and said we wanted to see him. Friedrich certainly hoped that the Austrian Empire would have an important supply point in East Africa, not to mention that, since Franz took the initiative, he would definitely have a way to solve the problem. In fact, since the British announced a complete ban on the African slave trade, Tanzania's status plummeted, and it was not until 1886 that it became a German colony. On the contrary, Kenya in the north was favored by the British because of its excellent ports, and they continue to invest in it. Even today, it is still one of the largest ports in East Africa. Franz, a later generation, naturally understood the importance of colonies, and Austria did need a supply station in East Africa. After all, this was still the age of the ocean. Of course, in the long run, if Austria can take the lead in completing its expedition to the Congo, it is entirely possible to establish a huge colony across Africa. There will be massive opportunities and challenges, of course. This is just a later story. From the current point of view, as long as it does not cause too bad international impact, the early deployment in Tanzania is definitely a sure profit deal. At this time, the Dutch businessman had already arrived on the deck after a simple search. He was a little surprised at first when he saw Franz and Friedrich, but he still took off his hat and saluted respectfully. "Hello, gentlemen. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Benny Urban. I was a slave trader once." This aroused Friedrich's curiosity. In fact, it is not difficult to understand. The slave trade in Africa was banned, and slave traders naturally lost their jobs. "I'm unemployed," Benny Urban said with a self-deprecating laugh. Then, Why do you think you can be the governor of Bagamoyo? It does not belong to the Austrian Empire, but is a free trade port. Franz asked with interest, and he specifically emphasized the free trade port word point. The so-called free trade ports at this time are similar to the free cities in history. They are geographical units that have a seemingly independent status and are actually protected by a certain country or controlled by an organization. I can help you legally obtain the rights to the coast near Bagamoyo. Benny Urban said very confidently. Friedrich immediately became interested and was interrupted by Franz just as he was about to speak. Then, why don't you go find someone else? What? Franz said was very hurtful, but when it comes to national interests, I have to ask more questions. Moreover, there are at least 4 to 5 countries that have the ability to operate Bagamoyo, including in fact their home country, the Netherlands, which has to be suspicious. They don't believe me, Benny Urban replied helplessly. Then, why do you think we will believe you, Mr. Benny? Franz's tone was calm. Here is a letter of authorization and a request for help from the 7 major tribes in the coastal areas of Tanzania: Sangu, Bina, Ngoni, Chaga, Pal, Chigwa, and the Weijing Kingdom. Can I take a look? Franz was curious. He had never heard of an indigenous kingdom doing this, but when Franz saw the letter, he was not so indifferent. Friedrich was curious about Franz's expression, so he came over. Isn't that Dutch? Friedrich blurted out. Can the factory be more professional? You should at least let an African ghostwrite it, so that the credibility can be higher. Friedrich swore that this was the stupidest lie he had ever seen. It's Dutch, yes, but it's the only language that all Tanzanian chiefs can understand. I promise to God that everything I say is true. The Arab army had already reached the vicinity of Bagamoyo, and the Portuguese fled the city after plundering all the valuables in the city. Benny Urban looked confident, but Friedrich still didn't believe his words. And if the Arab army really reached the vicinity of Bagamoyo, it would prove that the city had changed hands. It is obviously not a wise move to start a war with the said dynasty of Oman. If the British get involved again, I'm afraid that the Austrian Empire will not be able to survive this time. It is impossible for the Austrian Empire to take a trip into these troubled waters. Do you think war is child's play? Franz couldn't tell whether the matter was true or false, but even if it was true, if the Austrian Empire seized an East African port at the cost of war with the Oman Empire, the price would still be too high. We fight the war. What do you think? Benny Urban showed his last trump card. Chapter 327. White slave traders who think they are black people plan to. Mr. Benny, do you think this is still the era in the 15th and 16th centuries, when a few businessmen recruited some mercenaries and went to war with the country? This exchange with the other party made Franz feel that it was a complete waste of his time. It was not uncommon for merchants to directly attack city-states with armed merchants in the early age of discovery point, but with the development of the times, the proliferation of firearms, and the natural elimination of history, it is almost impossible for this situation to happen again. What's more, an empire as powerful as the said dynasty of Oman has a navy with 25 battleships, 58 guns, 38 frigates, 79 sailboats, and hundreds of auxiliary ships, with a navy of 32,000 people. Such a large number of enemies cannot be easily defeated simply by relying on merchant arms. Strictly speaking, the 58-gun battleship equipped by the Omani Navy can only be regarded as a frigate in Europe, and other types of ships are also reduced versions. The standards they follow are more like the maritime classification standards of the 18th century, and the number of sailors alone is even greater than that of their Austrian counterparts. In addition, the army of the Oman Empire has nearly 50,000 soldiers, including more than 15,000 cavalry. What's even more frightening is that it is not difficult to support such a powerful army with the country's financial capabilities, and their dominance in East Africa has even been recognized by the British. Of course it is not recognized by other countries, especially Portugal and France. You can laugh at me for being whimsical, but every European businessman who remains in Bagamoyo hopes to have unimpeded free trade and passage rights. Every generation of residents who have lived in Tanzania hopes to bring Arab people were driven from their land. In a sense, Beni Urban was telling the truth point, because after Oman acquired the vast territory of East Africa, it used a multi-pronged approach to monopolize trade and launch slave hunting wars to more cruelly exploit the local indigenous tribes. Even salt and iron were raised to an almost unbelievable price point. On the other hand, the Oman Empire continued to squeeze out passing Western merchants in a semi-public way, and even strictly prohibited those Western traders from participating in the slave trade, leaving it to the Arabs to monopolize it. In addition, a commercial competition mechanism was introduced to lure Indian businessmen to East Africa and increase the export price of goods, causing setbacks to their Western counterparts one after another. So what do you want, dreamer? Franz still didn't feel that the businessman in front of him was someone who kept his word and could fulfill his promise. After all, he was born too late to catch up with the glorious age of navigation, and he was born too early to catch up with the wave of national liberation. Living now is destined to fail him. Unless he is an expert with strength and ability. Intervene personally. I need 5,000 rifles and 20 cannons, Beni Urban said seriously with a solemn look on his face. After hearing this, Franz and Friedrich couldn't help laughing. After all, this request was too low. 5,000 rifles plus 20 cannons. £6 or £8. The total value even with shipping costs does not exceed 100,000 florins. This is something that would be as difficult as the sky in the eyes of ordinary businessmen. But for these two people, it is as simple as a lift of their fingers, because after the Napoleonic Wars, major European countries invariably introduced measures to restrict the circulation of combat weapons among the civilians, and it was simply difficult to purchase large quantities. Even if they could get what they wanted, it would only be after paying a very serious price. For example, the French often sell to civilians at a price that is 300% to 400% higher than the original price. Then, what can we gain? Franz asked. Bergamo is about 30% of the annual tax and ownership of the city. As long as you have the ability to drive away said, the entire coast is yours. Beni Urban replied. Said refers to the Sultan of Oman at this time. He was a very capable monarch, but he was also very hated. 30% tax sounds like a lot, but in fact, as a port city with only 18,000 people, its most profitable industry, slave trade, has been banned, so the actual tax revenue must be greatly reduced. As for the attractive condition mentioned by the other party that, if you drive away the Omanis, you can get the entire coastline, it is an out and out attempt to make a bigger pie. It is obvious that the risk of this transaction is too high, and the return is not ideal. It may even be a trap waiting for one of you to jump into. And Franz was inspired by the other party, and he had already thought of a better idea to manage this land. Let's think it over carefully. Sir, it's getting late, please go back. In the end, Franz still hoped to send the other party away with a polite and decent gesture, hoping to give him some dignity. What else do you have to hesitate? I'm betting on my life, and what you pay is just a small number of weapons. Beni Urban wanted to help broker the deal, but unfortunately this strategy didn't work for Franz. Mr. Beni, life is precious and should not be gambled lightly. This is blasphemy against God. Franz finally decided to bring up God to deal with the businessman in front of him. It's just that the other party looked like he wouldn't give up until he achieved his goal. He wanted to step forward to continue the argument, but was stopped by two soldiers. I am the Prince of the Wejan Kingdom. With my status, I can contact the indigenous tribes in Tanzania to fight against the Arabs. I only need 5,000 rifles and 20 artillery pieces, but you don't look like a black man. Friedrich found the guy in front of him very interesting and became interested. I am an illegitimate child, and my mother is Dutch. Beni Urban saw hope, and he was encouraged and continued. There are 6,000 warriors in the kingdom of Wejan. My father is the great King Wejan. Yanyambe. The illegitimate son of a black chief was not an honorable thing in this era, but what shocked Franz and Friedrich even more was that there was such a powerful presence in the interior of Tanzania, plus the 7 mentioned before. This tribe might really be able to fight the Oman Empire. Why did this black prince, your highness, bear the fate of a slave trader? Asked Friedrich. Curious as to why a white man who considered himself black would sell black people. I knew you would ask this, because we are different from you. If my country did not rely on the slave trade, it would lose a stable source of salt and iron. You all know the importance of salt to people. And if there is no iron, we will not be able to protect our country and our families. We are surrounded by tribes who are in the same situation as us. If we want to avoid the fate of becoming slaves, we have to sell others into slavery. This is to survive. But now the Omanis are coming. We don't even have a chance to survive. They want to regard all of us as objects that can be enslaved. At one point my father, the great Nyambe, asked me to go to Europe with my mother. What I saw were kingdoms without slaves. We didn't want to be like this. If you want money, we will give you money. If you want crops, we will give you crops. But please don't enslave us. Don't kill us. We just want to live. Chapter 328 Common Enemy. Although on the surface, slave labor only needs to maintain his living expenses, but in thorough calculation, its price is the highest of any labor. A person who cannot acquire any property will seek the most for food and the least for work. Apart from this, he will not care about anything else. Judging from the experience of all ages and countries, I believe that the labor of free people is cheaper than the labor of slaves. Adam Smith Benny Urban said what he meant, but Franz did not want to dampen his passion. After all, the greatest advantage of the capitalist system over slavery was the efficiency of exploitation. Mr. Benny, your story is very touching. But I want to remind you that Europe at this time is far from the beauty you imagined. And the British official has announced a complete ban on the slave trade. With their naval strength, I believe it will not be necessary how long before the slave trade was completely eliminated from Africa. As for the war between you and the Omanis, we are really helpless. Although the other party's speech was very touching, Franz was not someone who was easily offended, and his words remained calm and cold. No, you are wrong. The slave trade has never stopped since ancient times, and it will never stop in the future. The British and Omanis wear the same pants. Benny Urban said plausibly. In fact, he was not the only East African country in history that hoped to sell its land to foreign powers in exchange for protection. The Masru family, which once ruled Mombasa, gave up their family territory as a protectorate for the British. At that time, a British naval colonel accepted the proposal because he thought it was profitable. But John Bull, never one to disappoint, soon discovered that side was willing to pay more. So the British, who have strong commercial genes, lowered their flags, withdrew their troops, and watched as the Mazraoui family was destroyed by said. It's just that Austria does not have as powerful a sea force as the British Royal Navy, which may not make said afraid, and at this time, the Oman Empire has long changed from what it used to be, and is already a veritable hegemon in East Africa. In fact, Oman and the British signed the Treaty of Moresby, which in fact, recognized Oman's dominance in East Africa and tacitly allowed them to engage in slave trade. The British's double standards have always been so outrageous. On the one hand, they can kill slave traders without mercy, and on the other hand, they can acquiesce in some people's legal slave trade, where a pair of pants. As far as I know, isn't the UK expanding its influence in the name of banning the slave trade? Friedrich and Franz were both a little confused when they heard this. After all, Britain had always promoted it with such great fanfare, and this was what it usually did. Said gave them benefits, but the British turned a blind eye and even sold them weapons and warships. This is in line with the consistent style of the Anglo-Saxons. It would be even more consistent if some inferior weapons and obsolete warships were sold to the Omanis after that. Benny Urban talked about all the bad deeds of Oman and the British flight camp, so I won't go into details here. Franz and Friedrich's eyes lit up, and they cheered up again. After all, Britain was one of the least popular countries in Austria at this time. Although there was no direct geopolitical conflict between the two sides, the overt and covert frictions and calculations had never stopped. Moreover, both of them have huge ambitions hidden in their hearts, and in order to realize it, John Bull must be an obstacle that cannot be overcome. We can provide you with weapons and necessary support, but the Austrian Empire will not intervene in the Battle of Bagamoyo for the time being. Even if you are about to be wiped out, we will not intervene in advance. In addition, we can ensure the survival of the kingdom of Weijin, but it must be included in the market cycle of the empire, and all of you need to abide by the laws of the empire, and obey the will of His Majesty the Emperor. Franz already had a plan in mind, but now was not the time, so he reiterated his position. Of course, if this group of people really wanted to successfully capture Bagamoyo, it would save them a lot of trouble. For 100,000 florins, even if there was only a 1% chance of eradicating a powerful British ally in East Africa, it was worth it. Not to mention, the Austrian Empire also obtained the early colonization of Bagamoyo and control of an important East African port, which is very beneficial to its future strategic layout. But even so, Franz still would not change his previous plan. After all, this kind of investment is just like gambling. Small bets make you happy, big bets are harmful to your health, and excessive bets are wiped out. No problem, I can agree to these conditions, but you must give us the treatment of nationals. Benny Urban, who is responsible for the fate of his country and his people, naturally has to be cautious when faced with life and death choices. Even if he saves the country through a curve, he must sell it at a good price. This is the professional ethics of a businessman. Of course, as long as they live within the Austrian Empire, support the rule of the Habsburg family, abide by the laws, regulations, and related policies of the empire, and perform their national obligations, they are Austrian citizens, and are protected by the Austrian Empire. The above words, he said, were expressed in a more formal tone, which made the people around him cast puzzled looks. They didn't know whether the Grand Duke was conveying his personal will just now. No matter what those present thought, this was how they defined themselves as future Austrian citizens. Friedrich glanced helplessly at his nephew, and the refreshed Benny Urban felt a long-lost feeling of being taken seriously, which made him satisfied. Day and Shannon heard a hint of overtones. Maybe what happened next refreshed Franz's understanding again. That is, Benny Urban was not a mere commander. He really had an army of about 2,000 people, including the total number of private armed forces of those businessmen. Close to 2,500 people. They originally planned to go to India to seek help and purchase some equipment along the way. Fortunately, those Indian businessmen also hated the Omani expropriation and provided a considerable degree of financial support and a lot of intelligence. But unfortunately, they encountered a tsunami on the way back and everyone was trapped in Mumbai. That's why these four places were created. A scene asking for help. Fortunately, Franz's fleet is large enough to accommodate these 2,500 uninvited guests through these business channels. Franz obtained another valuable intelligence, that is, the alliance between said and the British was not monolithic. Just like the relationship with the Indians, both Britain and India have benefited greatly from trade with Oman. But these Arabs want too much, and they are restless. Side cultivated cloves and spices on a large scale in Zanzibar, which undoubtedly impacted the spice market in India. In order to sell slaves at high prices, they always flirted with the Americans and the French, which made the British, who were business experts, very disgusted. Just as Franz expected, the British were also looking for opportunities to cheat the Omanis. So he was going to write a few letters. Chapter 329, Falling into a Trap. After nearly a day of replenishment, the fleet embarked on the journey again, but this time it was favored by the goddess of luck, and encountered the Indian Ocean monsoon. Friedrich received assurances from Benny Urban that Bagamoyo had sufficient coal and supplies to provide for his side point, so he was overjoyed and ordered the fleet to set off. With the help of a hybrid steam engine and sail, it reached its destination in less than 6 days at a super high speed of 20 knots. Bagamoyo is the oldest city in Tanzania, but this slave fortress, whose architectural styles can be described as diverse, may be more appropriately called a town in the eyes of Europeans at this time. Looking around, there are ancient European style buildings, indigenous style thatched huts, simple style houses made directly from mud, and even halal style and some unusual temples, but overall it can be summed up in 3 words: old and broken. The local European businessmen can be said to be miserable to the naked eye. These people wear Rococo or Regency style clothes that are completely isolated from the world. The men's exaggerated and complicated clothes, leather high-heeled shoes, and wigs make them look like they have traveled through time from the 18th century. The women's clothing is also very artificial, but it is similar to the mainstream European style in 1842. But it is still far behind the fashionable Vienna. And their bodies seem to carry a strange smell, which Franz and his team could smell, even if they were several meters away from the group. Oceanian looked at the European women walking nearby in surprise. After all, her classmates in Vienna even wanted to soak in the water all day long and use various petals and spices to stew the smell from top to bottom. But from the appearance of these women in front of us, we can easily conclude that they don't even want to wash their heads. What surprised her even more was that the sweat stains, tear stains, bird droppings, and all kinds of strange stains on their clothes were clearly visible. The intoxicating smell exuding from their bodies could put off a pregnant teenager. The port is surrounded by people of colorful colors, and they obviously welcome the arrival of the Austrian ocean-going fleet. Due to the rise of Mamba support, Bagamoyo's business is getting worse day by day. There is no doubt that this port is dying. Franz and his entourage also discovered a strange phenomenon. That is, there seemed to be a lot of Arabs on the dock, and there were even slave ships leaving the port carrying entire ships of slaves. When Benny Urban and his men walked out of the subsequent transport ship, the white people on the dock let out huge cheers. At the same time, the Arabs next to them immediately began to be on guard, and some merchant ships even sailed directly, leaving the port. Franz and Friedrich both knew that those people's actions must be out of fear of reprisal from the whites, so they took the initiative to inform their masters. However, this has no impact on our own schedule. After all, the fleet is just here to replenish supplies, and will leave this place of right and wrong in 2 days at most. So they didn't think it would bring them any trouble. But the two began to plan the future of this port. Franz felt that Bagamoyo would inevitably become an important fulcrum of the empire in East Africa. Especially its importance would further increase after the opening of the Suez Canal. Of course, in his dream, if all goes well, the ultimate goal is to connect it with the Congolese colony to form a super colony across Central Africa. Pragmatist Friedrich believed that Bagamoyo met the necessary conditions as a military port. Natural barriers and good depth would bring more trouble to the attackers, but its limitations are also obvious. That is, it is not big enough. If a huge fleet is stationed here for a long time, it will appear small, and once the number of ships on the offensive side is doubled, the advantages and disadvantages of offense and defense will be completely reversed. Compared with Bagamoyo, Friedrich was more optimistic about Dar es Salaam, which was still a small fishing village at this time. The water there was deeper, and it had more space and more ideal depth. But at this time, Dar es Salaam is still a poor and unknown village. It may take 3 to 5 years to completely turn it into a fully functional port, and when people realize its superiority, sex may still take up to 10 years. Dar es Salaam, located at the mouth of the Rufu River, was the capital of Tanzania in later generations, but at this time it had not yet shown the advantages of a deep water port, and building a port from scratch has never been easy. While the two were still immersed in thinking, boxes of weapons and black powder were moved to the shore, and batches of supplies and coal were sent to the ship. However, in order to prevent accidents, Friedrich ordered all officers and soldiers not to stay on the shore or go deep inland. Everyone is hoping that nothing will go wrong, affecting the plan to leave the city early tomorrow morning after supplies are completed. After all, the next trip will face the most difficult pass on the voyage, the Cape of Good Hope. Until this moment, Franz and his party had not realized that they had been deceived. Everyone was anxiously looking forward to the arrival of dawn and the start of the next day's journey. The sun also rises as usual. Luca Massaninha is a lookout on the Venetia, the flagship of the Austrian Empire's Mediterranean fleet. He gets up on time at 4:30 in the morning as usual, preparing to take over at 5 o'clock. Companions work. The first ray of sunlight in the morning was particularly dazzling. Luca Massaninha, who had very good eyesight, soon saw that there seemed to be some small black spots approaching where the sun rose. This is a very unusual situation, because there are so many black spots, like a mighty fleet. As a lookout with a keen mind, he realized that this was a precursor to a conflict at sea, but he was unable to confirm this fact. Lying or misreporting military information is a very serious crime in the military. Marcino, come here and see what is that dark patch in the distance. Luca, Machinina called to his companions on the watchtower, but received no response. According to common sense, this sleepy guy must be lazy. After all, our ships are anchored in the harbor, and it is almost time for the changing of the guard point. But just at the moment, when he decided to take a few bites of bread in the shadow of the watchtower, to replenish energy before changing guard, a drop of unknown liquid fell on his head. Luca Machinina touched it casually. Based on his many years of experience, he judged that the sticky and warm feeling should be a pile of fresh bad droppings. Fortunately, it didn't fall on the bread. Luca Machinina secretly rejoiced. Just as he was about to wipe the bird poop on his pants, he found a trace of red liquid dripping down. The people above are dead. He looked at the watchtower in disbelief, but the people above him didn't move at all. Thinking of the large number of black spots ahead that he had detected, he immediately shouted, "Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Attack! Enemy ships are attacking!" Luca Machinina shouted as he climbed towards the watchtower. Marcino, Rosa is still waiting for you to go back and marry her. Damn it. You still owe me 20 florins for wine money. How? He wished it was just a prank by his stupid friend, but the reality was cruel. A crossbow arrow shot through Macino's eye and nailed him to the mast. Luca Machinina picked up the telescope and saw an entire fleet of sailing ships approaching them. Northeast, 20 nautical miles. Enemy attack. Enemy attack. Based on experience, he judged that the opponent was less than 20 nautical miles away from his side. Some book friends must think that 20 nautical miles is too far, and there must be no problem in discovering the enemy's situation so early, but in fact, the steam battleships of this era often took 2 to 3 hours just to start up, not to mention other tasks such as anchoring. Chapter 330 Encounter on a narrow road. Enemy attack. Enemy attack. Noisy shouts and chaotic footsteps woke Franz up. He immediately got out of bed, put on a coat, and walked to the captain's room. What's going on? Where is the enemy attack coming from? Signal. Let those Arab ships not come over, otherwise they will be regarded as hostile acts and annihilated. Yes. As soon as the messenger left, an adjutant answered the fleet commander's question. At the changing of the guard in the morning, 5 lookouts were found dead, and then we discovered a large number of galleys and frigates, as well as small troop carriers, in the northeast. Friedrich slammed his fist on the table. Bagamoyo's harbor was just big enough for the Austrian fleet to break out of the bay and form point, but if they want to rely on the terrain to hold onto the bay, the Biang Navy has learned from the past, not to mention that Bagamoyo has no decent defense force at this time. Commander, we can use our artillery advantage to defend the bay. The enemy's numerical advantage is not enough to make up for the lack of firepower, Adjutant suggested confidently, but before Archduke Friedrich could praise him, Archduke Franz poured cold water on him. What? If the other side blocks the entrance of the bay and sends troops to capture several forts on land at the same time? Although they pose no threat to the enemies outside the bay, they are fatal to us inside the bay. Just imagine if they are attacked by both land and sea at the same time. How long can we hold on? Especially the terrain at the mouth of the bay made Franz think of a word, that is, catching a turtle in an urn. The adjutant wanted to argue, but was stopped by Friedrich. Stop talking nonsense. Obey the order. Once the opponent completes the siege, there is no need to occupy the land fort. You only need to guard the mouth of the bay and get some fire attack and self-destruct ships to trap us alive. At that time, even if you want to rush out with all your strength, the opponent will, as long as a few warships are scuttled and turned into artificial reefs. The exit can be blocked, but it will take time for the steam engine to start. Damn it, you idiot. What are we keeping our sails for? Set sail and set sail. At the most critical moment, Friedrich chose the most correct approach. All the warships in the fleet spread their sails and rushed towards the Arab fleet. The two fleets were like two sharp arrows colliding head-on the sea, and the Venetia was the sharpest arrow point inside the bridge. What's going on? We just transported some weapons and gunpowder. Even if the Omanis want to retaliate, they can't mobilize the fleet to Bagamoyo so quickly to surround us. Muscat, the capital of Oman, is a theoretical core area of the said dynasty, and it is nearly 4,400 kilometers away from Bagamoyo on the Persian Gulf. Impossible. I also saw the Arabs who escaped yesterday, but it would take 10 days at the fastest for them to make a round trip, even with the help of ocean currents, monsoons, and steam power. What's more, it seems that the other party did not add steam power. Franz was also confused. He was very confident that no fleet could do all this. Suddenly he had a very scary idea, that is, the whole encounter, starting from negotiating terms, using Bagamoyo and Tanzania as bait, and then loading up the so-called Bagamoyo businessmen, and the current attack by the Omani fleet is all a conspiracy. The other party had already taken action from the first day, arriving just the morning after we arrived at Bagamoyo port, so as to catch us by surprise. But that seems unreasonable, because such sophisticated plots often cannot be realized in reality. As long as there is a problem in a certain link, everything will be lost, just like Babbage's analytical engine. Babbage is currently director of the Austrian Imperial Institute of Numerical Computing, and a member of the Royal Society of Sciences, and even if Benny Urban lied, where would he find these thousands of professional actors? The local people's feeling of being rustic and pretentious cannot be achieved by just any extra act. The Venetia and 4 first-class battleships barely managed to rush out before the opponent blocked the entrance of the bay, but don't even think about grabbing the T-head. Seizing the T-front is a very important step in naval battles. The party occupying the T-front can face the other side of the ship and have a good view, which is convenient for command and concentration of firepower for the side that did not grab the T-head. Only the flagship has a good view, and the ships behind have a large number of blind spots. Even after being misplaced, it is still difficult to command and dispatch. And the most important thing is that the battleship artillery of this period was on both sides of the ship. At most, there could only be a few movable Karen cannons concentrated on the bow. This kind of firepower was too small in naval battles. Even a super first-class battleship cannot resist the firepower of dozens of 58-gun macro battleships at the same time. Omani Navy Pasha mate couldn't help laughing when he saw the Austrian Navy rushing out of the bay and heading straight towards him. Yes, a very correct decision. The other party is a very good general. This kind of judgment and execution ability are really admirable. But it is a pity that he met me, otherwise he would also be a man who can engrave his name on a genius who entered history. Let us praise Allah and send off his enemies. The 20 battleships of the Omani Navy spread out in a row, the gun doors slowly opened, and the black muzzles were pointed at the Venetia. Let go. The gunner of Med's flagship gave the order, and the 6-pounder cannons and 8-pounder cannons spit out tongues of flame one after another, and black smoke covered the sky. These Omani navies are all veterans of long-term battles in the Indian Ocean. They did not slack off, because the other party did not change hands. Instead, they reloaded as quickly as possible and prepared for the second round of shooting. No matter whether the other party chooses to continue to die or retreat to the bay to survive, they will not be able to escape their sanctions in the end. They were waiting for the smoke to clear so they could admire each other's faces, twisted with fear or anger. Because only in this way can we prove that the Omanis are the masters of the Western Indian Ocean and East Africa, and the white people's false gods are worthless here. However, a salvo from a fleet did not sink even a single Austrian Empire battleship. Although there were many broken corpses on the deck of the Venetia, the crew still controlled the tattered sails and continued on. Go ahead. May did not see what he wanted to see through the telescope. There was no white flag, no sunken ship, and no screaming crew members jumping into the water to escape. Keep shooting. Kill them all, otherwise they will inevitably become the powerful enemies of our great Oman Empire. In the name of Allah, grant them eternal death. In the second and third rounds, the Venetia pressed forward step by step like an immortal undead. In fact, these new battleships of the Austrian Empire are all wrapped with a layer of iron. Although it is just an extra layer of iron, the protection has been greatly improved. In addition, the Venetia was originally a super-class battleship with quite thick oak armor. It was not easy to break through the armor with small caliber artillery point at this time. Its appearance was covered with a layer of iron armor, and all the Omani Navy's main artillery could do was scrape it, spread out. By the time Maid discovered the other party's intentions, it was already too late. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 331 The Brave Wins. To be honest, Franz didn't like the feeling of standing on the front line in danger and watching the shells flying. But now that he was on the pirate ship Venetia, he couldn't help but think so much. Uncle Friedrich, you should be lucky that your opponent does not have high explosive shells. Otherwise, we would have returned to the embrace of our ancestors by now, Franz said, pointing to the solid cannonball that had just shattered the reinforced glass and smashed into the bridge. Franz, I think it's best for you to leave here. No matter what, this is the front line of the battle. As the captain, I naturally have the unshakable responsibility, and you are just our guest. Friedrich continued to observe the enemy situation around him with a telescope and said calmly, Uncle Friedrich, we are all descendants of the royal family after all. If we retreat without permission or even escape at the slightest hint of danger, I'm afraid it will have a serious impact on our morale. At this moment, the two of them were chatting calmly, and their calm expressions immediately eased the tense atmosphere in the bridge. After all, there were two royal princes sitting in charge, so even if they died in battle, it would not be a big loss. Moreover, most of the naval officers at this time were of noble origin. During this period, the nobles paid great attention to the so-called temperament elegance point. As a result, a strange phenomenon occurred on the ship. Although everyone was pretending to be calm, it gave people a really calm atmosphere. There was so much gunfire outside that even the glass was shattered. Someone came over and asked Archduke Franz, do you want dessert and coffee? Coffee, thank you. Although Oshiyasa Jean on the side has always boasted that she is not afraid of death, at this moment she only dares to lie on the ground and look up at her master. Miss Shanayan, you will increase the probability of being shot like this. Not to mention that you will catch a cold easily if you lie on the deck, and it is also easy to trip other people, especially now that we are in the middle of a battle. Franz reminded kindly. Archduke Franz, aren't you afraid? Dao Yanshan asked with a trembling voice. Afraid? That's natural. But it's a bit late to talk about this now. Since you can't refuse, let's enjoy it. Do you need dessert? The other party did not see that this was Franz's pretending to be calm answer, but she felt that his unique image in her heart was now even greater. Please, give me some sugar. It is said that it can calm people down. Shanayan finally mustered up the courage to kneel down on the deck. Franz took 2 sugar cubes and handed them to her. The sudden and violent impact caused the hull to almost lose its balance, and various lamps and interior items fell like rolling stones. Obviously Friedrich's ironhead tactics worked. The flagship Venetia directly rammed and sank the largest warship of the opponent. The enemy warship wanted to escape at the last moment, but the Venetia, equipped with a steam turbine, the power of the sail battleship is not comparable to that of this sailing battleship. The 4,700-ton superclass battleship Venetia directly smashed Maid's flagship Veritas into pieces. The Omani Navy, which lost its flagship, immediately fell into chaos. However, this was only the beginning. Later, the Austrian first-class battleships, also wrapped in iron sheets, entered the enemy's formation one after another, turning the Arab fleet upside down. At this time, Friedrich, who was standing on the command podium, shouted loudly, "Sign up and tell them to prepare for the second phase of the attack." 5. First-class battleships with full firepower in the enemy formation is terrifying enough. Although the Omani Navy's pseudo-battleships did not cut corners like the Egyptians, they could not withstand the close fire of the first-class battleships. But soon the Omanis discovered some strange launchers on the deck of the enemy ship. Although this kind of rodless spin rocket is very powerful, its poor hit rate makes it almost useless in naval battles, but that's only under normal circumstances. such as this kind of close-range melee, where the advantages of rockets are most vividly demonstrated. Most of the sailors in the Omani Navy are pirates. They have dealt with ships and death all their lives, so they are not afraid of death and boarding battles. The battle situation at this time shows that it is difficult for the Omani artillery to cause effective damage to those enemy giant ships. In this case, a boarding battle may be a good choice. There were even Omani generals who took off their clothes and stood on the bow of the ship with only a scimitar, just like the Barbary pirates who once shocked the world. But this soon proved to be a wrong decision. When the Austrian anti-infantry rocket exploded in the air, the unarmored Arab warrior instantly became a sieve, and the scattered steel balls directly cleared the deck. The killing effect of incendiary rockets is even more obvious, as the combustibles spilled by the explosion fall directly on the wooden deck or people's bodies. Just one spark will ignite a fire that reaches the sky. Those Omanis who were about to jump to the border just now were instantly turned into a burning man. He could only jump into the sea in order to survive. Of course, Made also prepared a backup plan, which was a huge self-destruct fleet. Like the Wahhabis, the Taliban, and members of Al-Qaeda in later generations, these people have very firm beliefs or are afraid of harming their families who are in the hands of Maid. In short, they are not afraid of life and death. It's a pity that with Maid's flagship sinking and the whereabouts of the coach unknown, no one can command this special force. When someone finally convinced some of its members to charge the enemy ship, they discovered a problem. That is, the self-destructing fleet cannot approach the Austrian warships at all. An insurmountable blockade composed of artillery, rockets, and marksmen. These self-destruction ships are nothing more than carrying a large amount of gunpowder and flammable materials, which are the favorite targets of the opponent's high explosive artillery shells and rockets, because they can trigger secondary explosions and due to the development of rifled technology in the Austrian Empire. Rifled guns are no longer superior, but can be equipped by all soldiers. The Marines who had been forced to hide in the cabin took this opportunity to vent their anger against the Arabs, who were fighting undeclared war. Friedrich's Marine Corps, as the only Austrian unit equipped with breech-loading guns, would naturally not miss this great opportunity to test the power of this new weapon. The rate of fire of the breech-loading gun was far beyond the awareness of the Arabs on the opposite side. They thought that after a round of bullets, they could reveal their heads to battle, but they did not expect that just a few seconds later their heads would be covered with bullets. Blood flowers exploded. As more opposing warships rushed out of the bay, the Omanis were increasingly at a disadvantage at sea, and they had no choice but to retreat. But as time went by, the steam engines equipped on the Austrian warships gradually began to work. It takes a certain amount of time for a steam engine to heat up from a cold state to a working state. How could a pure sail warship outperform a sail steam hybrid ship? The battle quickly turned into a one-sided massacre. Since the Omanis fought undeclared, the Austrians naturally had no need to abide by the conventional rules on the battlefield. The naval soldiers picked up their rifles and long hooks to wildly kill the Arab soldiers who fell into the water. Several large battleships continued to pursue the remaining enemies in the front, while the small warships following behind destroyed all the enemies they saw and salvaged them. By the way, some goods. The people of Bagamoyo, who had witnessed the whole process from the shore, rejoiced because the Omanis who had oppressed them for many years were finally defeated. But Beni Urban and a group of Bagamoyo dignitaries were horrified and speechless. They thought that the Austrians would be defeated by the Omanis, who would be so weakened that they would let them go. However, the terrifying combat effectiveness displayed by the Austrian Navy really made them sweat. Chapter 332. Pursuing from morning to evening, Friedrich found himself following the enemy's lair. It's a shame to say that the Austrian Imperial Navy seems to be better at attacking cities than fleet battles, because the target is big enough and their firepower is strong enough. The obvious trading port in front of us had no barrier to stop the attack of the Austrian fleet. Soon the area around the port turned into a sea of fire, and both Franz and Friedrich were convinced that the fleet they encountered was the main force of the Omanis, and wiping out a country's main fleet is undoubtedly a huge blow to it. The Omani Navy will not be able to make a comeback for at least 10 years, and naturally it will not send warships to continue to pursue its own agenda. The great man once said, "Beat the drowned dog." Franz naturally understood the meaning. At this time, Failure to protect Oman's kindness would become their motivation for revenge. Breaking their spines at once will make these unruly guys much more at ease and can reduce unnecessary casualties in the future. With this in mind, Franz and Friedrich poured all the rockets they brought on the port city in front of them. Just as they were considering whether to send marines ashore to continue the cleanup, an Arab boat sailed out holding a white flag. "Stop fighting, we surrender," the bearded man holding the white flag cried, obviously frightened by such a high-intensity war. "Who are you? What qualifications do you have to convince us?" Although it was great to win, being inexplicably involved in an unknown war really made Friedrich very unhappy. "I am Majid, son of Emperor," said the great governor of Zanzibar. "We have really surrendered, and I ask you not to fight anymore." This prince, who is usually inferior to one person and superior to 10,000 people, now used a pleading and groveling tone. "Pray for peace. Haha, it turns out that you are the leader here. Why didn't you inform us when you provoked a war without permission? Your behavior is nothing more than razing this city to the ground." Friedrich, determined that the man in front of him was the instigator, and he was going to make a big deal, so that he could go back and build a few more battleships and then come back and beat this bastard again. "It is Made Pasha who led the army to attack you. It is none of our business. For the sake of the merciful Lord, please do not burn my city to the ground." As the second son of said, Majid grew up listening to the legendary atmosphere of the Oman Empire's victorious battles. In Mombasa, even the British, who are known as the strongest in the world, have to avoid their edge. He has always believed that his country is the third most powerful country in the world. The first is the Ottoman Empire, the second is the United Kingdom, and the third is the Oman Empire, and one day he will lead the invincible Omani navy to rule the world. However, the sight before him completely shattered Majid's dream. Flames engulfed the entire city, and only a few ships managed to escape from the Omani Empire. After hearing the news of the tragic defeat, the King of Kings, sitting in the center of the palace, his father, said, actually lowered his head and shed tears, and asked him to go to the sea to ask for surrender. On this day, Majid's world collapsed. He was sitting in a small boat, accompanied by his most trusted mute servant. Legend has it that every great sultan had a firing squad of deaf-mute people. The once prosperous port was now being engulfed by crackling fire. The setting sun was like blood. Terrifying explosives continued to fly out from those huge iron warships, plunging the city into the embrace of fire again. Majid raised a white flag high, which shattered his dignity, but before he could feel sad, the cannonballs whizzing past his ears waved the flag vigorously. "You put it lightly. Then how do you calculate the loss of my people, my ship, and my losses?" Friedrich roared. "We are willing to compensate according to the price." The nature of the Arab businessman prompted Majid to say such a sentence out of nowhere. "Compensation? According to price? Pull that stupid prince up." Friedrich shouted. The soldiers hurriedly dropped the ladder and came to Majid's side, but instead of helping him up the ladder, they directly tied up the prince and pulled him up like a piece of cargo. The mute servant, who was struggling to save his master, wanted to stop the approaching soldier from being kicked into the sea. However, the officer lost his patience and pulled out his pistol. Majid yelled, "Don't come over, I'm fine." Franz, who was watching the play on the side of the ship, nodded approvingly, and with his conscience still intact he asked, "Are you Majid?" Friedrich sat at the negotiated table. "Yes. We sincerely hope to double compensation for your losses. In the name of Allah, please believe me." Majid changed his previous words, and was also surprised by the young man. He thought he would be a mature and prudent general, but he didn't expect that he would be a little kid without a beard. At that time, Arabs generally wore beards, which had special meanings. One of the punishments was to burn their beards. "Do you think having money can solve everything? How should the lives of my soldiers be calculated?" Friedrich seemed aggressive, but Majid, who was a cunning businessman, knew very well that the other party must think that he did not give enough money. 3 times. "I'm willing to compensate your country 3 times for its losses, and I'm willing to work with your country to maintain security in the Western Indian Ocean and jointly combat the Zouas and pirates." The Zouas and pirates were once an Arab pirate gang active in the Western Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. 3 times? Friedrich touched his chin. Seeing that the other party agreed so happily to 4 times, it shouldn't be a problem. He should let the adjutant report the battle losses first. Andre, the adjutant who understood this, hurriedly ran to Friedrich, sometimes speaking loudly and sometimes whispering. Grand Duke, it is a great loss for us that we cannot agree to them. Although not a single ship sank, and the only one was encountered in a storm in the East Indian Ocean, more than 300 brothers were killed or injured in this naval battle. Among the 5 battleships, the flagship was more seriously damaged. But the ammunition loss was considerable. Hundreds of tons were consumed in this conflict, and all 10,000 rockets were empty. After roughly calculating the account, Friedrich felt that 2 million florins was more appropriate, so he waved and whispered, Franz, the compensation our navy requires cannot be less than 2 million florins. The remainder is it's up to you to play freely. Franz nodded, walked to the negotiating table and sat down. Who are you? Majid asked in confusion. Our leader. Friedrich introduced in an easy to understand word. Now Majid was even more shocked. The one just now might have looked younger, but the one who came this time was completely a child. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. It's really irritating to compare people to each other. We need you to pay £1 million in compensation and cede all territory south of Bagamoyo. I'm really sorry, this is completely beyond our country's ability to pay. Moreover, the territory south of Bagamoyo belongs to several different families, and we cannot decide for the time being. Then, we can use our methods to convince those families. What do you think, Franz? Asked for a high price, and Majid sat on the ground to pay back the money. After some bargaining, the 2 parties finally signed the Treaty of Zanzibar. That is, the Oman Empire compensated the Austrian Empire for £500,000 and ceded the area south of Bagamoyo to Austria. From the date of signing of the agreement, the 2 parties ceased hostilities. Chapter 333. Do you want to be the governor? April 24, 1842. Maybe a day that will go down in history for Oman is on this day. On the burning coast of Zanzibar, the East African overlord Oman admitted defeat for the first time in the past century aboard the super-class battleship Venetia. In this battle, their proud navy paid a heavy price with 19 battleships, 15 frigates, 38 galleys, and a large number of arson ships and self-destructing ships. Not only that, a total of more than 18,000 Omani people, including Commander-in-Chief of the Navy Made Pasha, were killed or missing. More than 2,000 houses were destroyed in the entire Zanzibar port, and civilian ships were in significant losses. 2 of Sultan said the Great's 8 sons were killed in the battle. Although there was resentment from the country, the monarch did not seem to have any intention of retaliating against the other party. On the contrary, he was very optimistic about the trade between AO and AO. Said son Majid strongly expressed his gratitude to Franz and Friedrich. Promote their cloves. The clove tree produces fine spices and oils. Clove oil is a yellow oil with a strong fragrance. It can be used to make various high-grade spices, perfumes, and cigarettes. It is even used as medicine in parts of Asia and Africa. However, the origin of this spice is not Zanzibar and Pemba. They used to be the flagship product of Indians, but now the clove production in Sanban and Beng has exceeded 60% of the world's production, almost monopolizing the global trade of similar commodities, and becoming a veritable country of cloves. This is where Arab businessmen are powerful. They are flexible, and have extremely flexible moral limits. Even their mortal enemies can do business without any scruples. In fact, the £500,000 war indemnity and the loss of land south of Bagamoyo did not hurt the said dynasty. What really made them unacceptable was the loss of the powerful fleet they relied on for survival and the money they had accumulated over hundreds of years of confidence. Once upon a time, the majestic Oman Empire punched Portugal, kicked the Netherlands, invited Arab heroes to fight, passed through East Africa, and spanned the Indian Ocean. They dare to attack the Zouas and pirates that the British dare not attack, and Mombasa, which the British dare not take, has long been their colony. Oman has been the overlord of the Western Indian Ocean since the age of discovery, but Sid knows that past glory does not represent everything. He was not an incompetent monarch, but on the contrary, he was very business-minded and strategic, so the East African overlord immediately thought of forming an alliance with the Austrians in order to maintain its influence in the Persian Gulf and the Western Indian Ocean. This is an inevitable choice, just like the treaty signed with the British. In addition, the Sultan also strives to actively expand business relations with Austria and strengthen the ties between the two countries at the same time. He also needs to rebuild a more powerful fleet and a more detailed and reliable intelligence network to ensure that this humiliation never happens again. On the Austrian side, it was not until the end of the war that Franz and Friedrich understood why the Omani navy could respond so quickly. The reason is that the opponent's capital has moved from Muscat in the Persian Gulf to Zanzibar, and their naval headquarters has naturally come to this small East African island point. But because it only happened in recent years, there are no markings on the charts on our own warships. This made Franz feel shivers down his spine. Before, he only knew that a certain unscrupulous navigation system often led people into dead ends, leak fields and the like. But compared with our own overseas intelligence agencies, they are simply weak. The chart, which had not been updated for several years, directly sent the voyage fleet into the enemy's lair. Bagamoyo is across the sea from Zanzibar, less than a day's flight away. The behavior of the Imperial Navy at Bagamoyo, unloading and transporting troops, was undoubtedly a serious provocation to the Sayyid dynasty. Of course, the proud Omanis also overestimated their own strength. They thought they could directly destroy the invading enemy fleet through undeclared war. After all, the victors are not condemned. As long as they can annihilate the maritime forces of the great powers, then naturally no one will dare to come out and make irresponsible remarks against them. It's a pity that dreams are beautiful, but reality is cruel. The nearly century-old strength gap between the two sides cannot be easily smoothed out. In addition, their stupid strategy angered their opponents. The Austrian Imperial Navy perfectly executed the policy of beating the drowned dog, causing the number of Arab casualties to reach as high as 1 incredible degree. And the culprits of all this are still at large in Bagamoyo. So how could Franz and Friedrich let them go? The next day, the ocean-going fleet visited this ancient port again. Although the welcoming crowd was obviously smaller this time, their enthusiasm became stronger. After all, the Austrians defeated their old enemies, those once arrogant Arabs, those demons who collected blood taxes from them, those who banned they were scumbags involved in the slave trade. Now those damn heretics have finally been punished, and their time is coming. But the first thing Franz did when he came to Bagamoyo was to ban the slave trade, which surprised many people. After all, the slave trade is one of the most profitable businesses in Bagamoyo at this time. Listen, I only came here to do 3 things. No slaves, and fucking no slaves. His brief and even slightly crude off-the-cuff remarks had the assembled audience buzzing. Your Highness the Grand Duke, you wrongly blamed us. We are not the culprits who are teasing you and your country. This is all the fault of that damn Benny Urban. Just punish him alone. The very smart businessmen in the audience chose to abandon their cars to save their commander and began to accuse Urban and his team. After all, sacrificing others to fulfill themselves is a required course for every ocean-going businessman in this era. They had already thought of a way out, which was to arrest Benny Urban and his associates to bear the wrath of Austria. In this way, not only can they keep their property, they may even become the new owners of the city. Of course, it was obviously impossible to hide this trick from Franz, so he was not prepared to let these villains succeed. Although Benny Urban was a shameful liar, he was at least a capable and courageous man. Perhaps there is another possibility. He did not want to deceive the Austrian guests, but there was some misunderstanding between the two parties. The very deceptive chart may be just a momentary oversight. Send him here. Franz gave an order, and 2 Austrian Marines stepped forward to hold Benny Urban's arms. Seeing this, the businessmen couldn't help but cheered from the bottom of their hearts and threw eggs, tomatoes and other debris to express their indignation at being deceived and their loyalty to their new masters. In fact, he had sent people to conduct an investigation before, which proved that Urban was indeed a mixed race, but he was not an illegitimate son, as he said, but a legitimate heir apparent. His father even exiled all his brothers and uncles from the kingdom of Weijin, so that he could successfully inherit the throne. Benny Urban was brought in front of the young Archduke opposite At this moment, the former's mentality is as if he is in a state of chaos, and he does not dare to look at the other party, especially after knowing his identity, and witnessing this miraculous battle point. An unprecedented emotion enveloped Urban's heart, a combination of awe and awe, a little admiration and guilt. Do you want to be the governor of Tanzania? There were no false polite words, no detours and circles, but straight to the point. Chapter 334 Bagamoyo Declaration. Franz's words just now shocked everyone. At this moment, both Benny Urban, the Bagamoyo businessmen, and the Austrians present had dumbfounded expressions on their faces. After all, Benny Urban had indeed deceived the Archduke in a sense before, and now the latter had an absolute advantage. No one would doubt that this young man could kill everyone in the port with just one order. Friedrich understood his nephew's approach. Politics is a profound art of compromise and cooperation. Even if it looks stupid in front of everyone, you must at least insist on doing a good job on the surface. Because the convenience and hidden benefits this brings to oneself cannot be ignored. The person beside him, Diane Shanayan, thought this was a very clever way to control people. Benny Urban also showed that he was very aware of current affairs and immediately seized the opportunity to show his loyalty. I am willing to serve the empire. I have lived in Bagamoyo for nearly 30 years, and I can also help you contact nearby tribes. I think they should all be very willing to surrender to you. I will dedicate Tanzania to you by any means necessary. I will be the most loyal servant of the Habsburg family. Although such a disgusting statement was a bit disdainful, Urban, who had grasped the life-saving straw, could not care less. Moreover, the position of governor of Tanzania is really attractive. It is a gold ingot dropped from the sky, both for him and for his family and tribe. Of course, this is also true for most people in this world. At this time, the businessmen who were hostile to Benny Urban started cynicism mode, which soon escalated into abuse and curses, because they knew very well that once the prince of the kingdom of Wigen, whom they despised, was defeated, he would definitely retaliate against them. Of course, in the face of Austria's powerful military power, they did not dare to do anything drastic. The kind-hearted Archduke Franz, he is not worthy of being the governor of Tanzania. A fat-bellied businessman pointed at Urban, with an exaggerated expression, as if the other person was a traitor who had deceived his ancestors for 18 generations. Yes, the 30% profit he promised you is too low. Our Novo Chamber of Commerce is willing to give up 70% of the profit. We are also willing to work for the Habsburg family. That bastard is a filthy primitive. He doesn't deserve to rule white people. I protest. The merchants in Bagamoyo were so excited that they almost drowned Benny Urban in his spit. After all, they thought that removing this stumbling block would mean getting a good job as the governor of Tanzania, and they would be safe for the rest of their lives, to say the least. If Urban gets it, they will be in hell. Not only will the family business and trade routes that he has worked so hard to build in Bagamoyo over the years disappear, but his own life and that of his family will also be at risk. However, for an emerging colonial country with insufficient external projection capabilities, it is precisely this kind of people with shallow foundations that are needed at this time to better rely on the majesty of the empire to maintain its rule. If it were replaced by an all-around local snake, it would be a big question mark whether he could effectively control the situation thousands of miles away in the long term. More importantly, Franz needs a capable person who can thoroughly implement his will and has strong execution ability. Prohibiting slaves is like prohibiting drugs, and it will not be possible to eliminate an old disease that has existed for thousands of years in a day. Listen, everyone, I want to solemnly announce 4 things here. First, Benny Urban would become the plenipotentiary representative of the Austrian Empire in Tanzania. Second, the Governor General of Tanzania will launch a comprehensive anti-slavery campaign. No one is allowed to participate in the sale of slaves, and slavery will be gradually abolished from now on. Unexpectedly, the moment he mentioned the second item, he immediately stirred up a hornet's nest. The Bagamoyo businessmen below invariably expressed their dissatisfaction with rich words and gestures. It's too harsh. If you don't even give us a way to survive, you might as well kill us. This violates the principles of free trade. Merciful Lord, please save us. However, their performance did not succeed in impressing Franz. Instead of paying attention to the crowd of people shouting in front of him, He turned his head and asked the soldiers to fire their guns. Sure enough, gunfire is the most effective silencer, and the noisy crowd fell silent instantly. Even though some people with ulterior motives wanted to take the opportunity to create chaos and incite rebellion, after seeing the Austrian soldiers' determined eyes and the black muzzles of their guns, their faces looked like wilted eggplants, and they did not dare to have any other evil thoughts. Coupled with the terrifying reputation of the previous massacre on the Zanzibar Sea and various other rumors, these restless groups were successfully frightened. He swallowed the phrase "kill someone, run away." That was on his lips again. Third, the government of the Sultan of Oman has granted our country exclusive franchise rights, and the Viceroyalty of Tanzania will shoulder the important task of spreading this spice to the world. Exclusive franchise may sound very tempting, but to those businessmen who are accustomed to the slave trade, it always feels a little strange. In fact, Zanzibar's clove trade has great potential. Although it now accounts for 60% of the world's production, its output will account for 90% of the world's long-term production starting in the late 19th century. Its profits once accounted for 80% of Zanzibar's national income, and now with the blessing of Austrian agricultural technology, I believe cloves will definitely become Tanzania's signature product. It is not uncommon in history for a commodity to revitalize a region, let alone such a commodity destined to shine in history. Franz was well versed in his plan to replace the slave trade with cloves, and as the perfume and soap and cigarette industries grew, demand for cloves would only grow. The cigarette market had not yet formed a large scale at this time, but having Franz here was not a problem, though slave traders certainly understood what the Grand Duke meant, and his determination to ban slaves. Audiences reacted differently to these three statements. Some people were disheartened. After all, they naively thought that this land would be their at a course after the Omanis were driven away, but they did not expect that the Austrians actually overturned the table. What they didn't know was that prohibiting future Austrian Tanzania from participating in the slave trade was also a prerequisite for Austria to monopolize the lilac trade in Zanzibar, so in return, the latter will turn a blind eye to Oman's behavior. After all, there is never a free lunch in the world. If you want to take a piece of meat from said without being resented, it will definitely not be adding salt to the wound. Instead, in addition to clearly giving the other party a chance to save some face, give him a date, so that both parties can temporarily even out the situation. Some people hold a disapproving attitude. After all, Bagamoyo's slave trading tradition is a commercial activity that has existed since the beginning of the Age of Discovery. How can it be so easy to abolish it? Others were ecstatic because they knew how profitable the spice trade could be. And the exclusive franchise mentioned by Archduke Franz is even more coveted. You must know that in this way, most external competitors can be eliminated. As long as a unified price alliance is formed internally, it is easy to create a monopoly and maximize profits. This is still a mixed message for the future residents of the Tanzania colony, but the last point Franz said is definitely a good condition for the people in front of him. Fourth, Tanzania is a territory of the Austrian Empire, and all subjects enjoy the same treatment as Austrians, and are protected by the Imperial Army and Imperial laws. This last statement is not only an explanation of Benny Urban's previous request, but also a reassurance, or a talisman, to those who have persecuted him. It was clear that Franz was not prepared to let the Benny Urban family dominate, and he knew very well the meaning of the proverb "don't put all your eggs in one basket," and only by allowing both sides to rely on Austria can their rule be stable and long-lasting. Some people in later generations closely linked the four chapters of the Grand Duke's Covenant with the anti-slavery movement of the same era, and it was known as the Bagamoyo Declaration in history. Chapter 335, letter asking for help. Shares in the second phase of the Vienna-Elitania railway project have almost quadrupled. Such a huge basic market has actually risen so much in just 2 months. This can no longer be described by the word horror. We must know that Apple, the world's largest market capitalization company in modern times, has a market capitalization of approximately $2.1 trillion. During the same period, US fiscal revenue was approximately $4.89 trillion, less than half of the latter, but at this time, the market value of the second phase of the Light project had exceeded 1 billion florins, which was more than 3 times the fiscal revenue of the entire empire in 1841. What's even more frightening is that this crazy rising momentum is still not decreasing, but is getting faster and faster. According to the optimistic estimates of experts, its stock price will exceed the 100 florin mark in the near future. To put it another way, that means its market value will exceed the 5 billion florin mark. You must know that the total gold and silver currency of the entire empire at this time is only 500 million florins, but the financial nuclear bomb in front of you is growing bigger and bigger like a snowball before a landslide. The financial experts who had previously sworn to hegemony had no choice but to admit that the stock had temporarily deviated from its true value, but they still firmly believed that its return to its true value was an inevitable objective law, and it was just a matter of time. Resisting the thought of throwing these guys into the Danube who would only repeat clichés with no new ideas, she was still anxiously waiting for Franz's reply. Yes, you read that right. Hegemony has sent many letters for help. However, apart from praying, there is almost nothing she can do for maritime communications in this era, which relies almost on metaphysics. Even if 2 ships are heading towards each other, there is a high chance that they will miss each other. Of course, the hot button issue of overhyping and overheating of stock prices that was making a lot of noise at this time also began to attract the attention of Vienna. Because the so-called second phase of the Lusitania railway project was nothing more than an empty frame created by Franz and his men. The only sections that are actually under construction are several important trunk lines in the plan and the Trieste-Zagreb-Belgrade line. This 550-kilometer railway is expected to be completed within 5 years. Including the railways that have already started construction, the total planned length is only 3,000 kilometers at this time. The massive funds raised cannot be consumed at all, and the only way is to expand the production capacity of some industries. However, the market has limits after all. Overcapacity, in turn, leads to a decline in product profits, forcing companies to give up this option. In the end, I had to restart some route plans that had been abandoned. Of course, if this momentum continues, the total amount of funds required for the entire second phase of the project will soon be exceeded. However, in the face of such a behemoth, no one dared to puncture the ball and could only let it kidnap the country. So far, 25% of Soros's plan has been completed. Of course, just 4 or 5 times the profit is not enough to satisfy these greedy guys. Their desires are far more than that. The southernmost tip of the African continent, the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope is located in the terrifying westerly belt, coupled with murderous waves and strange ocean currents. The combination of these 3 dangers has created the Killing Cape, the most dangerous route in the age of discovery. Fortunately, it is the turn of spring and summer in May, so Franz and Friedrich will not experience the boiling soup and boiling water scene in person. It would be thrilling to come here during the peak summer season. Of course, Franz didn't like looking for thrills, so after listening to reports from the navigator and other officers, he chose to pass the Cape of Good Hope at full speed during a safer season. Taking advantage of his spare days while repairing ships in Bagamoyo, Franz initially established order in the newly acquired colony of Tanzania. His methods opened Benny Urban's eyes and gave him a new understanding of the so-called kindness. Eliminating evil and eradicating its roots were just 2 abstract concepts in his mind. But in the past few days, too many dazzling things have happened. First, the once arrogant Omani navy was wiped out, while the 2 precocious noblemen were chatting and laughing. Later, under Franz's instruction, several tribes who wanted to sit on the ground and raise prices were punished. The saying that wildfires never burn out and are rekindled by the spring breeze is only for weeds. If a person turns to ashes, he may not be able to be reborn, unless you regard the return of ashes to dust as the rebirth of life. Friedrich acted in naval battles, and Albrecht was good at land battles, but when it came to how to torture vegetables and fight public security warfare, neither of them together was as good as Franz. The method is very simple and intuitive. Just set fire to the grassland, deliberately leave an escape passage, and finally seal it. Next, in order to truly eradicate the problem, the lands of those tribes were designated as generous conditions for offering bounties on their heads. As a result, even the clans closest to those tribes also joined in this hunting feast. During the entire process, the Austrian army did not have a direct conflict with the rebels, so the direct casualties were almost zero, but the killing efficiency was astonishingly high. Entire 4,000 tribes were completely exterminated, and even traces of their lives were artificially erased from the world. Before Franz and his party set off, they successfully ambushed the Zouaves and pirates who were planning to take advantage of the situation. These pirates were defeated faster than the Omanis, because their job was to be robbers, not armies, so the confrontation between the two armies would naturally be more disadvantageous. Fortunately, we didn't mobilize all the troops this time, otherwise it would have been the swan song of the Zouaves and pirates due to the huge generation gap between the weapons and equipment of the two sides, and the fact that they were ambushed when they thought they were sure of victory. The pirates were very aware of the situation, and chose to surrender at the first opportunity, and did not resort to any trick of pretending to surrender. Jumping state war, Bangjing warfare, also known as boarding warfare, is a very passionate and brutal way of fighting. Except for a few ruthless bandits who refused to surrender, and the unlucky ones who were shelled. As soon as the war started, most people became prisoners. Some of the pirate leaders had the idea to surrender to Austrian royal nobles, so that they could attack their old enemies, the Omanis, in the future. But Franz, who saw through his trick, did not intend to bite this not so sweet bait. Instead, he handed all the captured pirates to set for his disposal. These bastards put forward the same conditions to the Sultan, saying that they could put aside their past grudges and jointly fight against Austria, but the latter did not accept the pirates' proposal. Because said was afraid that this was a game deliberately set by Franz to test him, and after experiencing the power of the opponent's fleet, no one would be stupid enough to join forces with the Zouaves and pirates to fight against such a terrifying enemy. Said had never been afraid of someone or a country in his life, but Majid told him that the enemy's commander was a minor and the commander-in-chief was a child. He really didn't know what a kid with huge power would do. As a result, those pirates who thought they were invincible became witnesses to the brutality of the Omanis. Almost no one of them could leave a complete corpse. Of course, the above crimes will not be remembered by the Austrians. What will be remembered in people's hearts are only the successful Bagamoyo Declaration and the Treaty of Zanzibar of Equality and Reciprocity. After these three wars, Tanzania has truly achieved great governance in a period of time by not picking up things on the road, not closing the door at night, and stopping children from crying. However, these are not commendable to Franz. After all, he has multiple advantages such as superior equipment and intelligence. If he cannot defeat his opponent completely, it will only be his own incompetence. After passing the Cape of Good Hope without any danger, our party arrived at one of the terminal points on the voyage, Namibia, known as the Gateway to Hell. This place can be said to be one of the earliest colonies established by the empire. The mining of gold and diamonds has brought strong popularity to the place. The gold rush and diamond rush enabled it to be upgraded from a large trading post with only 200 people to a model colony in just a few years. But before he could rest ashore, Franz received a letter from a Jenny asking for help, and a huge financial catastrophe had just surfaced. Chapter 336 Hero Saves Beauty. After reading Ajana's letter in detail, Franz suddenly felt that everything around him was dull, and he completely lost his mood to continue enjoying himself. It was clear that the original plan of continuing deep into the colonies in the interior of Namibia to investigate developments was no longer expedient. Not to mention the great achievements of visiting the pygmies of Cameroon and the great dreaming chief Lewis, and investigating the White Chief, Colonel Morrison. On May 28, 1842, after several months of long voyage, Franz finally returned home. First we landed in Venice, and then took the train back to Vienna the next day. He returned in a hurry, and did not even have time to attend the triumphal ceremony in Venice, because a group of conspirators had been in action since February 5, 1842. They took advantage of the installment loophole to cash out and drive up the stock price. What's even more frightening is that the high stock price was built on the property and expected income of all the citizens of the empire. This is a continuation of the previous content. The general idea is that civilians got the goods with installment payments and then mortgaged the goods to financiers. Financiers then use the price difference to sell them abroad to make profits, or mortgage them to banks to obtain loans, and finally give the money to civilians, who use it to buy stocks in the hope of obtaining future income. Then pay in installments to buy new goods, and take out a loan. See the previous chapters for details. In theory, this type of economic crisis should not occur now. However, Austria's deformed economic structure and Franz's arrogant operation that he thought was concession benefiting the people. Coupled with the current torrent railway boom and the combined efforts of many parties involving traders who transcended the times, this financial crisis was finally created. To explain it in a popular way, a gentleman takes a beautiful woman to buy luxury goods such as LV bags, diamond rings and gemstone necklaces on Saturday, but the final payment is made with a checkpoint. But in the West in the 19th century, banks were closed on Saturdays. The store clerk came up with an idea, in order to avoid causing losses to the store and himself, and to retain customers, that is to first withhold the items the other party bought from the store, and then hand them over to the other party after the bank is open on Sunday and the check is cashed. Reproduce the scene. The smiling clerk stared at the gentleman and the beautiful woman, and then said kindly, "I'm sorry, sir, the check you used cannot be cashed today. If you don't mind, you can store the leather bag you purchased in the store for a day. When the bank opens tomorrow, we will cash the check and return it to you in person, along with a beautiful hanging chain specially made by our store." One day later, when the clerk rushed to the bank and found that it was a bad check, you can imagine his anger when the tricked clerk angrily approached the gentleman. The other man said, "I was on base yesterday. Thank you for your cooperation, sir. Why are you playing tricks on me like this?" The clerk was still very angry. But the cynical gentleman just smiled in response, "Sure enough, you don't understand what art is. Since neither you nor me nor the bank have any losses, shouldn't this be a happy ending? Even that stupid woman thought yesterday was because of love. That's right. In the end, a world where only beautiful women were injured was achieved. The gentlemen here naturally represent profiteers. The clerks represent the royal family. The identity of the bank remains unchanged, and the beauties who were deceived are the civilians who were bewitched. Everyone thinks that their logic is perfect, and even the victims will use the reason that they fell for the scam because they can get the expected income. Not to mention the shrewd clerks and cunning gentlemen and the banks that always abide by the rules. This is the essence of this crisis, and what Franz has to do at this time is to hero save the beauty, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. To be honest, you are also responsible for the situation that has deteriorated to this point today. Franz's tone was still calm, but those economic and financial experts think, perhaps, due to excessive pressure, Jenny made errors in judgment and reaction. She tried to change the subject and shirk responsibility. Franz suddenly buried his face in the other person's chest. This sudden move made her feel a little uneasy and confused. Please don't misunderstand. He just wants to test whether people's heart beats faster when they are nervous, not to take advantage of others. Hey, you are also an old man who has dealt with all kinds of groups. Can't you still see clearly that the so-called experts are all a bunch of liars? Please let me refer to their opinions, which you have said personally. Jenny began to change her strategy and said with a slight grievance, "If you have never met or don't understand her, you will be confused by her and feel that you are exaggerating. After all, a beautiful woman who looks aggrieved and weak will always make people feel pity." But Franz had seen it before and would not believe her. "Miss Jenny, why are you still in your 30s? Before Franz could finish his words, he was held in his arms by the excited person and became speechless. 18. No, I will always be as young as 17. She, who is extremely sensitive to age, emphasized repeatedly. Obviously age is a woman's nemesis. No matter how proud or confident a woman is, her defenses will be broken. Okay, 17-year-old Miss Jenny, if you don't let go, I will suffocate to death. Franz, who smiled dryly, now regretted letting her work out. Although it is more eye-catching, her strength seems to be running in the direction of supergirl. Jenny could experience some changes in Franz. He seemed more mature, more dangerous, and more fascinating than before. Point of course, only for people like her who have a particularly strong desire to conquer. Others feel more of a cold and chilling feeling. Point after all, Franz dug a lot of holes during this trip. Although the wars and conflicts that had been triggered had taken away countless people's statements, they were just an appetizer for the entire plan. Point it is unknown how many lives will be needed to fill these holes in the days to come. Point. But one thing that hasn't changed is Franz's attitude, which is either casual or well informed. Point even she, an outsider, could see that Austria's financial crisis was imminent. Point faced with this extreme anomaly, Franz, as the backbone, still had the time to teach him a lesson or tease herself, which made her feel very confused. "Are you giving up on yourself?" Jenny asked maliciously, with a bad expression like a fox that had just deceived the crow. "Why do you ask such a question?" The future heir of Optimus Prime, who was usually confident, had a blank expression at this moment, as if everything in the world had nothing to do with him. "Didn't you see the letter I sent asking for help?" "I've finished reading it." "Then why don't you seek a solution?" "Because there is no need." After a moment of silence, Jenny asked, "Are you pretending to be calm, or are you really helpless?" "Of course not. I really don't know what to say. In recent years, you have been working hard for the future of this country almost all the time. But your attitude today is very different from before. Could it be that you have changed your views on those financial speculators?" "I'm touched by your heartfelt words, but I know how to deal with this matter." Just when the conversation fell into silence again, Franz grabbed the other person's conscience and spoke earnestly while looking into her eyes. "Miss Jenny, please don't be so obvious next time you act as a double agent." Although Solomon Rothschild did a good job this time, his overly conceited nature will sooner or later make him fall into trouble. And I guess he didn't. "Don't really trust anyone, isn't that the same for you?" Jenny asked with a smile. "Don't worry, I'm very experienced. How can I gain the other party's trust if I don't do this? What's more, according to my investigation, the mastermind this time is not Solomon, but a young man named Soros. This man was a Jewish merchant from the Ottomans. But according to my verification, he was not born and raised there, but a refugee from Hungary. Of course, this identity is also likely to be forged. There is information that this person is most likely related to the previous Hungarian slave trade incident, and is even more likely to be the real mastermind behind the incident. All in all, this is a very difficult opponent that needs special attention. In addition, their target price is a 60 florin plan, and the harvest will be completed before August 18th, 1842, which is considered as a birthday gift to you. At least that's what they said in internal meetings. It seemed that her investigation was quite detailed, but the act of betraying herself made Franston feel a little angry. "Miss Jenny, you have betrayed me thoroughly. I have been hiding for so many years, and I'm blind in vain. You know what the proverb says? If you don't let go of your children, you won't catch the wolf." Jenny tilted her head and explained, "So, I'm the innocent child?" Franz half joked and half laughed at himself. "Isn't it true for your age?" she asked. "Okay, is that all the information you got?" "There are also some I wrote in the report." "Yes, it's in the third drawer on the right side of your study," Jenny whispered beside Franz. "Only this, of course. Not only that, they also gave me £100,000 and bought a mansion and 10 square kilometers of ranch in the United States, located in Boston. If you fail and have no face to face your family and country, you can consider setting foot on the new continent with me. I will take care of you," Jenny said with a smile. "I advise you not to go to the United States." After some careful consideration, he said confidently. "Why?" she asked, looking at the other person's statue-like perfect face with interest. "It won't always be peaceful there. There may be rivers of bloodshed in the future." Chapter 337. Is there such a good thing? "So it seems you are confident?" Jenny could still roughly feel Franz's opinion. Of course, these self-righteous guys still laughed too early. Little do they know that I have already asked people to increase the export tariff on the resale of royal products. I believe that their capital chain will be broken before long. Franz looked so smug that he couldn't help but disappoint the female subordinate who had been with him for a long time. Is this your well thought out strategy? Yes, don't you know that they have already thought of corresponding countermeasures? Even if they stop now, these financiers will make a lot of money, and the real injured will only be the civilians who follow the trend. Jenny said to Franz's indifference was incredible. Then, let them make this snowball bigger? Franz asked. At least if you don't expose the emperor's new clothes, the superficial prosperity can still be maintained. Otherwise, once the window is broken, the entire country's economy will plummet, the national wealth will suffer huge losses, and the people will lose hope for their own destiny and future. Is this what you want to see? Jenny said worriedly that after all, the more you understand about this crisis, the more clearly you can feel the horror that affects your whole body. What's the stock price now? Franz suddenly changed the subject. It has risen to 40 florins, and the market value has reached 2 billion. She answered truthfully despite not knowing why. That's almost it, because the empire simply cannot produce goods worth 3 billion florins. Franz's conclusion left Jenny a little confused. In fact, these financiers had a lot of fun and even allowed installment payments to be made using products that had not yet been produced as collateral. There is a lot of money and goods in the market that did not exist before, which is why the stock market can be pushed to such a high level. While raising export duties on specialized goods for sale, Franz began to drive down their international prices, because after several years of development, Austria's industrial production capacity has increased a lot, and it is completely feasible to use low price strategies to better defeat competitors. Jenny naturally does not understand these principles. She only knows that the products manufactured by Franz's manufacturers have been in high demand in recent years, and they can be used as general equivalents to obtain loans from merchants. June 1, 1842. As mentioned before, after Franz's two heavy blows, the capital chain of the financial consortium was immediately broken, and they could no longer play this trick of spiraling up to the sky with the left foot stepping on the right foot. The first to be unable to resist was the Birken family. Their roots were not in Austria at all, and they were completely invited by Solomon to get a share of the pie. Since I have already made money, there is no need to continue to take risks, so I took the lead to clear the stock arbitrage and leave the market regardless of the objections of other financiers. This blockbuster news spread from Vienna that day. In order to stabilize military morale, Soros and Solomon held several meetings to discuss the next response strategy. The newspapers were full of accusations against the Birken family and articles that were optimistic that the stock would continue to prosper. However, starting from June 2, major players rushed to escape, and stock prices plummeted. Among them, Solomon was the one who led the charge. The boss shouted not to run, while clearing out his inventory and leaving. As for Soros, he has successfully cashed out before, and has even completed the transfer of some assets. After a week of circuit breaker, the market opened on Monday, June 13th, and the royal family and the government jointly issued a statement announcing a bailout. Immediately afterwards, the stock market only rose briefly and then plummeted, ending at the limit again. As of June 15th, the price of the second phase of the Lusitania railway project has dropped to 59.8% of the original price. Previously, due to concerns about the stock market crisis, Franz and his staff set the upper and lower limits of 5% after discussion. Therefore, after 10 lower limits, it still remains at 59.8% of the original market value. If it is an upper and lower limit of 10%, after 10 lower limits, the market value is only 38.64%, since these financiers had long used their connections to bribe a large number of politicians in the securities industry. Those who fled were all big capital with backgrounds. Of course, if there are big nobles or members of the royal family who want to sell, those people will give it the green light. Just to encourage people, Franz used the words of Mrs. Sophie and Archduke Franz Karol to reiterate the attitude of the Habsburg family that would not sit back and watch the country fall. Of course, except for a few diehards, no one would believe in the effectiveness of Austria's reassurance under such circumstances. On the evening of June 15, 1842. The government, the royal family, the second phase railway project construction management authority and the Imperial Railway Company issued a joint statement to manage the construction and management of the second phase of the railway project in 5 territories in West Africa, Ivory Coast, Guinea, Togo, Cameroon, and Namibia. The bureau merged to form the Austrian Royal Overseas Development Company. Taking out these 5 pieces of land directly shows the determination and attitude of Vienna. Those investors who were almost desperate suddenly felt like they had a new lease of life. At the same time, the newly established company issued a notice announcing that from now on it would use 50% of the profits from the West African territories as dividends. This attraction is more stimulating than any economic stimulus method. Due to the publicity of financiers in the past 4 months, the number of retail investors in the second phase of railway stocks has increased by nearly 4 million. Although the current population of the empire is around 38 million, there were an average of 4 to 5 people in a household at this time. Therefore, these 4 million people almost covered people from all walks of life throughout the territory. Especially in the Nalatania region, everyone became a shareholder in the Royal Overseas Development Corporation. As we all know, the first thing needed for colonial development is financial resources, so these financiers happened to offer Franz a great gift to gather wealth. Due to Austria's special national conditions, its internal market is flooded with a large amount of expected banknotes exchanged for real gold, silver or commodity mortgages. No one except Soros actually cashed out, and all they got from selling their stocks was some expected cash. During this period, Austria's precious metals have been flowing in due to the various talents of financial tycoons, but Franz didn't intend to make a fuss about his credibility, so those financiers didn't have to worry about losing everything. But they will have to wait patiently if they want to use those expected cash in exchange for real money to take to other countries. This process may take 3 to 5 years, or may last as long as 10 or 8 years. In short, they will not become waste paper, but it is very difficult to transfer assets. Of course, there is no solution at all. That is, buying goods is subject to high taxes on specialty goods. The establishment of the Austrian Royal Overseas Development Company also brought another benefit, that is, it raised domestic attention to colonial development to several levels at the same time. The number of people willing to work in West Africa is also increasing. After all, many of them have become shareholders who can enjoy dividends, so they naturally have the motivation to work hard. This was the second confrontation between Franz and Soros. The bandits sent by the former did not successfully capture the latter. The latter's strategy failed to kill the former's empire, so it was just a tie. As for other financial consortiums that seem to be making money but don't seem to be making money, there is still a lingering feeling that they are losing money to Grandma's family. Of course, a small number of diehards who persisted became more convinced of their beliefs through this incident. That is, the Habsburg royal family will not abandon his subjects. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 338 Central Bank. Faced with this man-made huge wave, Franz decided to take advantage of the situation and use the extra funds to establish a West African development company with dual royal and national backgrounds. Of course, the hard work of the common people has not been forgotten, so allowing those 5 million households to become shareholders can be regarded as a disguised form of national ownership. It is worth noting here that financiers are not completely idle in this economic storm. At least they have objectively promoted the speed of Austria's process of gathering scattered private wealth. If the country takes the initiative to do this, it will be very troublesome and will attract a considerable degree of criticism. There happens to be a ready-made scapegoat at the moment, so why not? Of course, this cannot be completely said. After all, the financiers among them who successfully escaped from the top still made some money. On the other hand, this stock turmoil actually helped the empire a lot. Although the speculators made profits, they actually paid real money. According to the practice of this era, credit currency still cannot completely replace the status of precious metals. That is to say, whoever has more metal currencies in their hands during the war can last longer. Of course, from another perspective, this also sounded the alarm for the empire. It was time for an old antique to retire. and the Austrian Imperial state-chartered bank should also come to an end. The time is now ripe for a central bank. After experiencing this crisis, the central government's ability to control financial affairs has been greatly strengthened, and the establishment of the Royal Overseas Development Company has cleared the final obstacle and made everything fall into place. The only thing left is a person with the right identity to formally raise this issue. The perfect candidate to meet this criteria is naturally Franz. In fact, central bank is no longer a paper concept or a new thing. As early as 1668, Sweden reorganized the Kreisbank into the National Bank, which is recognized as the world's earliest central bank. The Bank of England was also born in 1694. From its inception, it became the engine of the Anglo-Saxons, providing financial support for their foreign wars and national policies. Its role in promoting British history can be said to be indispensable. As a classic line from Currency Wars states, "As long as I can control a country's currency issuance, I don't care who makes the laws." Although this sentence is both illogical and exaggerated, it does illustrate the indispensability of currency issuance to a country. The central bank actively plays such a role in social life. It is the dominant financial center institution of the central government and an important tool for intervening and regulating the development of the national economy. In addition, it has the unique power to issue currency and is responsible for formulating and executing national policies, monetary and credit policy, and the implementation of financial supervision. The specific method of operation is to increase currency liquidity through means such as reserve requirement ratio and interest rate cuts to boost the economy during economic downturns when the economy overheats. Raising interest rates and increasing the reserve requirement ratio are used to raise funds to reduce market heat. For example, the famous Federal Reserve can use its powerful influence to harvest the wealth of the world. Anyone would be envious of making money by printing money. Franz would also be interested in experiencing it for himself, if possible. The governor of the central bank is actually a high power and important position, and even a drop of oil and water flowing out is enough to shape a new family. Ordinary people simply cannot withstand this temptation. At this time, the laws of the empire have not yet been perfected, and the supervision is even worse. Improving legal provisions and strengthening the supervisory role cannot be accomplished overnight. Although Austria is so big, it can still be done by finding a few loyal ministers. However, considering that central bank governors need to have both strong professional qualities and the ability to adapt to circumstances, there are very few qualified candidates in the hearts of most people in the empire. There is only one name that is ready to be spoken: Solomon Rothschild. If there is no intervention, it is very likely that he will be the one to win the central bank in the end. Of course, Franz would not watch this stupid thing happen. He already knew the candidate for the governor, but it was just because this time all the conditions for establishing a central bank were fulfilled. What Franz did was just go along with the flow and advance the time of its establishment. Baron Brook has been tested by time and history with his loyalty, integrity, and ability, and remains unmoved even in the face of the vast amounts of gold in California. It's just that, if a rare official like him who is dedicated to his duty and remains in the land of the sun, he can easily become a stumbling block in the way of people's wealth. The land of sunshine, that is, California, Sunshine State. But it is actually a pun, and book lovers need to understand the details. Although Franz repeatedly told Archduke Karl Ferdinand through his subordinates traveling between the two places to ensure the safety of Baron Brook. Jenny was even asked to mobilize her strength to protect her secretly, but the speed at which such an honest and upright person offended others was still far beyond imagination. In less than 3 years, he has been attacked by more than 100 gunmen. Although it is related to the poor local security and radical policies, it is really exaggerated. But it is still inferior to a certain Central American Olympic champion. The bearded cigar-smoking Cuban survived 638 assassinations in his life. In his later years, he once said, "My survival to this day is entirely due to the CIA's dereliction of duty." Of course, if there is an Olympic sport to avoid assassination, then I can definitely win the gold medal for my motherland. In this way, we don't have to work hard for the girls on the women's volleyball team. In the 19th century, assassination methods were still very primitive. 99% of the chances were to directly intercept and kill someone face to face with a hired gunman, or to rush into a hotel with a knife. Those who knew how to kill with poison were high in talents. A very small number of smart and fierce killers will choose to use explosives to carry out halo attacks, but the actual success rate is pitifully low. Points due to the lack of power of black powder. A considerable increase in mass is required to ensure successful removal of targets. Currently, there is a lack of excellent detonation means, and fuses often need to be lit. This method, which is not sufficiently concealed and flexible, is very powerless in the face of heavy security. Several killers who tried this method only ended up halfway to death. Because she often hangs out with her weird boss, Ajani is almost perfect at using phishing and law enforcement methods, not to mention her subordinates who have heard and witnessed it. The result has been a killer shortage throughout California, and prices have skyrocketed. Although Baron Brook has been staring at death so far, fortunately, the Austrian side can solve the problem first every time, even if there is only one accident. This important figure in the Austrian Empire would go to see God in advance. Therefore, bringing him back to the country is not only a matter of trust in him, but also a safety consideration, and in a sense, it is also a compliment and test for him. People cannot escape from doing wrong. Even saints make mistakes, let alone immortal. Moreover, the prominent position of the president of the Imperial Central Bank is probably no safer than that of the general manager of the California Roma United Development Company. After all, this position will affect the interests of more people, and it will be more terrifying than facing assassination methods like knives, guns, and explosives. Chapter 339 Shocking the Heavenly Being. Vienna. Caesar Hotel. In a luxurious suite decorated in Baroque palace style, Solomon Rothschild was having dinner with a young man. I admire your courage. No one would have thought that you were still lurking in Vienna at this time. Do you know how many people are working hard to find a wanted person? Our dear Archduke Franz offered a generous reward of 1 million florins for your head. The other party tied up the scarf very elegantly, picked up the knife and fork, poured himself a glass of wine, swirled the scalded wine in the glass, sniffed and smiled. It seems like you don't intend to trade me for that hefty bounty, so I won't be polite. Saurus drank the contents of the cup in one gulp. This rude behavior did not arouse Solomon's disgust. On the contrary, it made him appreciate the intelligence, cunning, confidence and domineering qualities of the person in front of him even more, as if he was seeing himself back then. This young royal nobleman is still very difficult to deal with. If it weren't for him, the income this time would have reached at least 200 million. After listening to Solomon's words, Saurus couldn't help but frown slightly. The former was keenly aware of this subtle movement. What's wrong? The former asked, deliberately pretending to be casual. Oh, no, it's nothing. I just think it should be a little higher, Saurus said thoughtfully, shaking the glass. I think so. After saying that, the two of them looked at each other and smiled. Solomon already knew that the other party had not only successfully cashed out before, but had even successfully completed the asset transfer. However, instead of feeling resentment, he admired the other party's courage and wisdom. Since his brother can marry his daughter to a savage from South Asia, why can't he follow his family's example and marry his granddaughter to this young talent? The savages in South Asia refer to the Sassoon family, which is also known as the Rothschild family in the East. But in Franz's view, they are the drug kings of Asia. First, he sold opium, and then used starch mixed with kale and clay as a detoxification pill to repeatedly harvest the wealth of local people. In the end, he successfully laundered his money and became a so-called business legend. During the Indian Ocean tsunami, Elias David Sassoon and his eldest son were trapped in Calcutta. They were imprisoned in a water prison on his own order and smoked opium for 7 days, almost losing half his life. However, historically, these two men had been running the opium business in East Asia for a long time. As the British troops stationed in Hong Kong, they also ran the piglet business. More than tens of millions of people were harmed by them. Who should these victims turn to for judgment? In comparison, the so-called punishment they received cannot be called punishment at all. However, this trick is really powerful in squeezing the bottom line. Many people went bankrupt this time because of the backlog of orders coupled with the subsequent establishment of the Royal Overseas Development Company. Many people who sold at a discount were angered to death. It can be said to be both murderous and heartbreaking point. If you want to get on board again, you will have to pay a higher price than before. Otherwise you will fall behind others. After all, this company can almost be regarded as a national industry. Solomon Rothschild sighed sincerely, and even he regretted it at this moment. After all, a full meal is not as good as a full meal point. But now that the stock price has been artificially increased by almost double, if you want to buy the stock back again, you will probably add the money you earned before, and all your previous efforts will be in vain. Soros smiled and spoke, not only that, all this is still an illusion. It's just a hard to get trap set by the opponent. This sentence aroused Solomon's interest. After all, not only Austria, but also the entire European financial community are very optimistic about the future of this company. You must know that the reason why Britain and France are powerful is that they can obtain massive amounts of raw materials and a broader market than their own countries from their large colonies. What do you mean by this? Although Solomon Rothschild had his own considerations, he still asked. It is obvious that Austria is currently copying the successful path of Britain and France, and the influence of a wise king on the feudal dynasty is unparalleled. Although the current Emperor Ferdinand I has no ability to govern, everyone knows that there is a person in the royal family who is extremely farsighted and has extremely strong execution ability. A wise king is very likely to turn the tide, so the people are full of confidence in the future of the country. They felt that Archduke Franz, the born saint who was the hero of recapturing Belgrade, captured Tanzania, conquered West Africa, and was sought after by the Catholic Church, was their hope. On the contrary, middle level and higher level bureaucrats and people with a little knowledge of politics believe that all this is just the Habsburg family building momentum for future generations of kings. And the real masterminds behind the scenes are his parents. The views of senior officials were confused by the true and false information. Interestingly, some scientists believe that the above evaluation overestimates Archduke Franz's intelligence. Every one of his suggestions and hypotheses deserves to be listened to by the entire scientific community, as everyone at the Royal Society of Science in Vienna agreed. For example, Babbage's analytical engine, which had been stuck on its own for decades, opened a skylight to a new world after using binary bits. A so-called periodic table of elements shocked the chemical community throughout the empire. No molecular chemist could remain sane after seeing it, and they all fell into unspeakable hysteria. But Franz's periodic table of elements is incomplete. Who told him to only remember the first 5 issues? It infringes on your pippin and itches your breasts. Hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, neon. Phase 3, the beautiful woman is kneeling and showering in the willows. Sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicon, phosphorus, sulfur, chlorine, argon. Issue 4, remarry Kangtae and rebel. Taigu pinches the new lie. What? Horizontal comment, anger, and shock. Potassium, calcium, scandium, titanium, vanadium, chromium, manganese iron, cobalt, nickel, copper, zinc, gallium, germanium, arsenic, selenium, bromine, krypton. 5 issues. Although it is just modern junior high school common sense in the eyes of modern people, it was advanced for the chemical community at that time. After all, Mendeleev's periodic table of elements had to wait until 1869 to come out, and this achievement alone was enough for him to go down in history and become one of the most famous chemists in the entire history of mankind. Together with Nobel. In addition, the number of elements discovered by humans is still relatively rare, so even if he knew about the 6th and 7th rows, he would not dare to write rashly due to the high risks and fear that the scientific community would be misled. And he always believed in the truth that, as long as he gave a correct direction, those chemists who were destined to leave their mark in human history could work backwards and finally decipher the entire periodic table of elements as a scientific giant. Avogadro's theories should be taken seriously by the world. It was Franz's discovery that made this unlucky man, who was supposed to be recognized only after his death, Now a rising star in the world of chemistry. He himself had great trust in the young Archduke, but when the genius saw the periodic table of element, he fell into madness. He began to talk to himself non-stop, and then continued to write and draw on the piece of paper. He even occasionally tore his hair and looked around for books until he marked the atomic weight and element properties one by one, and then he breathed out, "What a masterpiece." A few days later, Avogadro handed over the revised periodic table to his colleagues at the Royal Academy of Sciences in his own name. By the time Franz returned from overseas, the former had been elected president of the Royal Society of Science. Chapter 340. Go their separate ways. Saurus cut off a bloody piece of beef with a knife, picked it up and slowly put it into his mouth, chewing it carefully for a while. He is 100 times scarier than you think. Although the colonial enterprise can obtain huge profits, it is based on massive investment in the early stage. It is a pity that the Netherlands and Portugal, which were so powerful in the past, are still paying off the debts of the era of navigation to this day. Solomon Rothschild immediately stopped smiling. He never imagined that the process would be so complicated. This time, he almost fell into a trap designed by a kid, and he couldn't help but gasp. Do you think it's just an excuse to cover up? The other party smiled and did not answer. He drank wine and looked at the embarrassed king. When dealing with this junior, Solomon did not have the airs of a senior at all and continued to ask shamelessly. The good news announced by the royal family is just to whet our appetite. Is the so-called dividend just a cover? Yes, in fact, this time the railway construction is also a cover. Before massive funds entered the railway company, many lines did not even start construction. And I learned through a secret channel that the project funds that were supposed to be used on these road sections were transferred to Mexico. Although Saurus seemed confident in his words, he didn't quite understand Archduke Franz's approach in his heart. After all, this move, which seemed to be completely unhelpful to the empire, actually happened. Therefore, even a genius like him who transcends history for hundreds of years needs to listen to other people's opinions. Maybe he can solve his own doubts. It's nothing. Austria contracted a piece of land in Mexico that was not favored by others, but it discovered gold mines there. It was a richer point at this time. There were more than 10,000 Imperial soldiers in California, and they controlled almost all the local indigenous people. Today's miners, farmers and even prostitutes are transported from other places. Solomon did have his own intelligence sources, but all opinions agreed that Tazanana was a tyrant who was greedy for profit and lustful. They were all very sure that one day in the near future, the Mexicans who coveted wealth would not be able to resist using force against California. Even if they dug up gold, the Austrians would not be able to transport it back to the country. On the contrary, the war with Mexico will eventually make one of the United States and France the ultimate winner on the North American continent, and Mexico will be completely eliminated from this competition. It's really interesting that the Habsburg family is always so connected to gold. Saurus said with a smile. He felt that America was indeed the promised land of the Jews. Playing the death game with such a dangerous opponent in Europe is far better than going there to make a fortune quietly. After all, if it weren't for that damn John Taylor, the United States would already be the territory of the Jewish Financial Consortium. Perhaps we should have worked harder to stop that traitor from the Democratic Party from coming to power. In fact, John Taylor's election as president was a surprise to people at the time. Except for Franz, no one knew that the old Harris would fall ill and die just after taking office. The former, like Andrew Jackson, is the ultimate fan of the Constitution of the United States. Once he came to power, he did not hesitate to offend the wealthy and thwarted the conspiracy of financial groups to control federal rights. Andrew Jackson's epitaph is simply, "Look, I killed that bank." John Taylor, like the former, struck hard at the financial consortium soon after taking office. However, he had already offended too many bankers, and the final outcome was destined not to be good. Solomon and Saurus had their own agendas. One was determined to conquer the United States, while the other decided to stay in Vienna. The previous idea of marriage was cancelled, and Saurus decided to leave after dinner. Solomon knew that the other party was wary of him and did not deliberately try to keep him. Being flexible, he has already planned to use the junior in front of him whom he admires very much as a stepping stone. although it may not be a wise move to invest in the so-called Austrian Royal Overseas Development Company now. If the empire extends its power to the outside world, then in the future the prices of steel and arms are bound to soar. Solomon planned to invest in industry because he foresaw that Austria would be plunged into a long war in the future, and both internally and externally, or the empire and its enemies would definitely need his help. When a cannon goes off, there is 1,000 taels of gold. This is a motto that has always been respected by their family. In order to ease the relationship with the royal family, it is crucial to find a worthy scapegoat. Thanks to herself for conveying Soros's story to her boss through that cunning and seductive woman. Soros had already made up his mind to go to the United States. He originally wanted to take the opportunity of marrying the Rothschild family to hide for a while in the Caesar Hotel, the most dangerous place in the empire. However, since the other party has not made this request for a long time, he has already seen that his situation is no longer safe. Fortunately, everything has been prepared in advance. Not long after he left the Caesar Hotel and boarded the carriage, there was a problem with Vienna's lighting system. A gas pipe leaked and exploded, plunging the entire city into darkness. When the lighting system was restored, Soros was nowhere to be seen. Illumination during this period mainly relied on gas lights. In 1807, Britain became the first city in the world to be lit by gas lights. Soon this technology spread throughout Europe, and gas lights were used in major cities at that time. As the capital of Austria, Vienna is no exception, but gas lighting has some inherent disadvantages, such as dark smoke and unpleasant smell. The biggest disadvantage is that it can easily explode and cause fires. Solomon did not send anyone to continue the pursuit. Instead, he returned to the dining table and swept away the leftovers. The old butler on the side was very puzzled by the behavior of His Majesty the King. After all, he usually did not drink from the sweet spring and did not eat unless he was practicing. If even one leaf of a dish is not arranged in a standard way, the servants will be ordered to throw it out and make it again. And today I actually use those leftovers, master. The food is already cold. The old butler reminded kindly. So, what? The most important function of food is to fill the stomach. The occasion and type don't matter. As he spoke, Solomon rubbed the bread that was used as tabla on the plate, not leaving even a drop of oil or water on it. No one can take what's yours. No one can. To be honest, Franz did have the intention to kill Soros, but the method with the highest success rate was to let a Ajani get close to the opponent, and it was possible for him to lose a general. The only way left is to send more people to look for opportunities. But this will be more costly, not to mention that it is very unrealistic to find the target in the vast sea of people. Instead of going through all the trouble, it would be better to go directly to some non-governmental organizations to draw prizes. Offering a bounty is a good idea. It can not only save yourself from being stigmatized, but also reduce your burden. Why not do it? Chapter 341 from Bavaria. The spring plowing of 1842 was just over. First Lorben is a German civilian from Bavaria. This is not his first time working in Austria. Compared with the pitiful income from farming in my hometown, the treatment of working as a laborer here is quite advantageous. Bavaria has always been based on rotten land among the German states. It is difficult to cultivate due to many pests and the harvest is extremely unsatisfactory. Although there are many river basins, the government is unable to control frequent diversions and flooding, let alone build water conservancy projects. Another point is that the agricultural reforms that have taken place in neighboring countries such as OP have made extensive use of agricultural machinery and new fertilizers, and adopted new farming methods to rapidly increase crop yields. As a result, the income earned by Bavarian farmers became even lower due to the establishment of the German customs union. Market connections in the German region have been greatly strengthened. The already distressed landowners were no longer able to resist the influx of foreign agricultural products. In order to maintain their own profits, they could only further exploit farmers, or serfs. With the meager income he earned from farming, he not only had to support his wife and children, but also had to give more than half of the harvest to the landlord. In the end, all he had left for himself was the remaining 50 or 60 florins. In order to save food and lighten the burden, he and his wife often find themselves in a difficult situation of not having enough to eat. The children are all as thin as fledglings without feathers, and their bones can even be seen through the skin. They had 6 children together, but only 2 survived. In addition to eavesdropping on other people's privacy, priests in the church even openly solicit prostitutes and bring their mistresses into God's abode. In addition, what they are best at is collecting tithes. Businessmen and officials work together to make food prices higher in disaster years. It is not unusual for the relief grains distributed by the above to appear in stores in the blink of an eye. Jackals are in power, rats are rampant, the rich have vast fields, and the poor have no place to stand. Officials, churchmen, and businessmen are the trinity, and there is no way to redress grievances after nightfall. The roads are dark, even the streets and alleys in the city. At that time, public lighting hours in Bavaria were generally less than 2,000 hours a year, and drunkards and gangsters often attacked innocent passers-by. Similar vicious incidents of wounding occur frequently, but the perpetrators often go unpunished, resulting in few residents daring to go out at night. Of course, this situation is very common nowadays, and Bavaria is not an exception. Except for the 4 countries of England, France, and Austria, public lighting facilities in other places are very poor even today. Going out late at night in France or a certain area in southern Italy still tests the courage of pedestrians. Back to business. Since the food crisis of 1838, First Lord traveled between Austria and Bavaria almost every year over the years. He has experienced a significant change in this country. People's incomes are getting higher and higher. From 50 florins at the beginning, he now earns over 100 florins a year, almost twice what he used to earn from farming. What is even more valuable is that workers with similar backgrounds can even use their breaks to go to mission schools to receive literacy education. Every week the factory invites a priest to preach. Although the contents of the sermons are all the same as those of the 3rd generation, namely loyalty to the emperor, patriotism, and respect for God, the enthusiasm of the workers has not weakened at all. On the one hand, the level of pastors in major countries is indeed higher than that of their counterparts in rural areas. On the other hand, using your free time to receive spiritual baptism can at least help relieve tense nerves and tired bodies. According to the provisions of imperial law, any organization larger than 10 people must conduct a weekly patriotic sermon. Loyalty education. The duration cannot be less than 1 hour, and employees must not take up rest or meal time. First time offenders are fined 10 florins each, and subsequent offenses will be doubled. They will also be whipped. As the empire's fiscal revenue was much stronger than at the same time in history, the government's power in law enforcement and supervision was greatly enhanced. The overwhelming secret police made no factory owner dare to neglect. Of course, they were nimble-minded and thought of attacking the church, but who would have expected that the latter would also issue a ban on purity teams, and offenders would take off their robes. If the circumstances are serious, the scalp may even be cut off and blessed with holy oil and sent to the gendarmerie for processing. What surprised First Lord the most was the Austrian public lighting system, which was not only bright all night, but also had mounted police patrolling the roads. Austria's annual public lighting time is 4,000 hours, twice that of Bavaria, higher than France's 3,500 hours and lower than London's 5,000 hours. Not to mention drunkards and hoodlums. Even gangsters don't dare to act recklessly on the streets easily. Killing may not be the intention of the mounted police, but in many cases it is not easy to stop a running mount. Even if he wasn't hit, no one could withstand the blow that gathered nearly half a ton of inertial force from the troops. The number of homeless people and beggars visible to the naked eye on the streets of Vienna is also decreasing day by day. Even the group of talents who are engaged in artistic creation can find their own pure land in the park. A rule in the Imperial city store also successfully ignited Leoben's interest. As long as the customer has collateral as security, he can get the product first and then slowly replace it on an installment plan. Usually the price of the former is several times that of the latter, but for an ordinary person like him who neither wants to sell the family's bag of golden beans, actually a bag of gold teeth, but also tries to get the things he needs because he temporarily lacks the financial resources to buy them. Say, installment payment offers great benefits during wartime, Farmers or refugees often join the ranks of corpse thieves, and one of the most profitable businesses is stealing teeth. Dentures in this era were expensive, and mostly made of human teeth, or polished metal such as gold. So it's not surprising that some farmers for generations have gold teeth hidden in their families, and knowledgeable tellers in department stores have seen even the most bizarre collateral, let alone a few gold teeth. When First Laban was about to leave after a certain visit, he was blocked by a diligent businessman. The well-dressed gentleman introduced him to him in the name of patriotism and wildly boasted about the huge potential of Nalitania's second phase of the railway project. He even used the first phase of the project that had already been completed and opened to traffic as an example to prove the foresight of the royal family and the imperial government. They are foresighted and will definitely take care of it. Although it was difficult to refuse such hospitality, the farmer from Bavaria still spoke honestly. "Sir, I accept your kindness. I'm very sorry, but because I purchased this harvester, I no longer have the energy to pay attention to the stock market. I plan to go back to my hometown and buy 2 mules to use this harvester to harvest wheat for others to make money." However, the other party was not discouraged and even seemed to have prepared a set of rhetoric. "It doesn't matter. If you don't mind, you can use your harvester as collateral first. Then we will provide you with a loan. It's still spring anyway, and harvesters won't be available until the harvest season. You can buy phase second shares first, and if you can't make money, sell it and buy a harvester. Of course, if you have the will to support this country and want to get out of the predicament you are in, why not try your luck with the stock market?" For a lower class civilian who can only write his own name in his 20s, this argument has to be said to be very attractive. Seeing that the other party was hesitating, the gentleman immediately added fire. "Previously, the stock rose 100% in 1 month. According to this trend, your assets will be able to increase at least 6 times by the time autumn comes. Just imagine, you can form a team to harvest with your brothers and sons. Laban Harvesting Company." He followed the gentleman's idea and even gave his family's harvesting team a resounding name. Chapter 340 To the outrageous meets the even more outrageous. Vienna, Royal Academy of Sciences. In fact, the periodic table mentioned earlier caused Franz some additional troubles, although the Austrian scientific community lived up to expectations and added all the element that had been discovered at this time to it according to the rules, but due to a small oversight on his part, krypton, Kr, an element that has not yet been discovered, was also among them. As a result, there has been a discussion in the chemical community, and curious people have given their own opinions on what exactly Kr is. Some people who knew nothing about German thought it was the abbreviation of King and Royal, which represented the royal family, but the unlucky guy was quickly thrown out of the venue by other scientists. Although it is not unusual or shameful to flatter the royal family, for a scientist to be so unscrupulous is a bit too much. Then the finger of blame was naturally pointed at the initiator, Franz. While he was thinking about how to get through, the experts present concluded through brainstorming that this was an element that had not yet been discovered, and Archduke Franz wanted to give this opportunity to others. How great and noble! Some people who had received the favor of this genius nobleman couldn't help but burst into tears on the spot. They took off their eyes and wiped the tears from the corners of their eyes with a handkerchief. In this way, he escaped disaster temporarily. However, the krypton element was actually discovered by the British W. Ramsay and M.W. Travers in 1898. There was still a long way to go to find this element decades in advance. New theories, new ideas and new technologies are constantly emerging in the live exchange scene, which is the best way to evaluate and guide any theory. And those scientists who are arrogant in front of others and even intend to challenge God will listen to this great discussion of scientific truth with the most sincere attitude. This is of course not only because Franz may be the future emperor, but also because almost every suggestion he makes will become a historic breakthrough in the scientific community. Of course, the church's crazy campaign also contributed a lot. After all, these gangsters still like to hug their thighs, no matter whether the person facing them is a child or something else. The 18th and 19th centuries were inherently magical times, and it was not unusual for scientists to believe in religion. It would be better to say that not being religious is what makes people feel alien. The most outrageous of them all is Sir Babbage. After following Franz's advice, he began to study the feasibility of binary and other carries, but she soon ran into trouble. Although Miss Ada was a talented person in mathematics, she was still slightly inferior to a real expert. Unable to solve their own problems, Babbage and Ada naturally turned to other mathematicians at the Royal Academy for help. They want to find the best carry, but obviously these professional mathematicians are not experts in engineering. After some research, these people came up with a so-called perfect carry. That is, E is approximately equal to 2.71828. This number is obviously completely nonsense to mechanical engineers, but after a lot of fuss by this group of mathematicians, the closest thing to perfection and industrially feasible is ternary, and binary can only be used as the second option. During this period, Babbage's analytical engine still used gears and did not involve electricity. So he quickly concluded that, in order to be infinitely close to perfection, he should adopt the 3 carrying route, and gave up the research on the decimal place. However, the outrageous thing had just begun. When the church heard that the 3 carrying system was the most perfect conclusion, all the bishops became excited and knelt down to beg God for forgiveness, because this unintentionally coincides with the Catholic doctrine of the Trinity, which means that there is only one God, but it includes 3 persons: the Father, the Son Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. Ever since the church invested in Babbage's analytical engine project, Babbage himself didn't know whether he was playing tricks on the magicians or was really brainwashed. He actually wanted to lead Miss Ada and his assistants to openly convert to Catholicism. After discussion, the church leaders actually let Babbage wear a white robe and become a theological scholar. When the fuss reached Franz's ears, he decided to add fuel to the fire by asking the wizard to design a new instrument that could help the church count the country's population. The current pace of population demography is very inefficient and slow, usually measured in decades, and so we see some of the most ridiculous things about the current period. We had to wait until the advent of the perforated tabulating machine decades later in 1890 to overcome this historic problem. Now Franz was ready to throw this problem to Babbage. After all, if the latter can complete this great undertaking, it will be beneficial to the country and the people, and it will also make his name more famous. In the 19th century, when electricity science was still in its infancy, computers, an epoch-making product, were still far out of reach as high technology. Therefore, the right approach was to first create as reliable and effective computers and statistical instruments as possible. Of course, it doesn't matter even if it fails. After all, it is not unusual for a statistics to take 10 or 8 years at the same time. Franz finally encountered the byproduct of the customs union and regional economic integration, the theory of racial superiority. This is an extremely terrifying trend of thought. However, what is even more frightening is that similar arguments were very popular in Vienna at this time, and even successfully misled a considerable number of scientists and celebrities, because subconsciously they more or less had a high self-esteem and believed that they were better than others. The propagandist of this theory was a captain with mediocre military exploits. He had almost never won a battle, but he did not think that this was the responsibility of his own incompetence in commanding the troops. On the contrary, he turned the finger and pointed it at the Italians and Jews in his own army, especially the latter, who were simply a group of despicable thieves and dirty robbers. Anti-Semitism is an old tradition in Europe. Although Austrian Jews have a higher social status, this kind of speech is still very popular. Some wealthy and powerful Jews became vigilant as soon as they heard such remarks. They had seen many such people for thousands of years, and all they wanted was power and money. As long as you buy him with power and money, he will become your most loyal lackey. However, times have changed, and people's thoughts have also changed. Viscount Baron actually did not accept bribes when one plan failed. The Jewish financiers tried another. If you are too soft, you will be hard. Death threats were sent directly to Viscount Baron's home. But as a poor nobleman, their family was so poor that they had no strength left. Viscount Baron's father even bought a coffin for the family overnight and placed it in the garden. After that, instead of restraining his words and deeds, this person intensified his behavior. He attributed various natural disasters, wars, diseases, employment, and even natural phenomena such as solar and lunar eclipses to those lower races. What's even more outrageous is that he also attributed the previous stock market crash to the Jews. Although he was searching for enemies in vain, he was unexpectedly close to the truth. It was the Jews who raised the stock price, and it was the Jews who were the first to sell stocks and cause the stock market to plummet. They are the murderers of this country. If the royal family had not given up its territory to save people, now we would have lost our property and become slaves to the Jews. It is well known that the more radical and attention-grabbing the creator of such remarks is, the easier it is for him to gather a large number of fanatical fans. Just like Kossuth, who promotes Magyarism, is more popular than Sachnie, who is rationally reforming. A large audience quickly gathered around him. Although most of them were idiots and speculators, there were also powerful businessmen and nobles among them. The existence of this kind of person makes Franz sleepless and sleepless. After all, Viscount Baron's thoughts are obviously contrary to his desire to establish a universal empire. History has proven countless times that a country can only follow one path. Chapter 343, A Murder. Monday, July 11th, 1842. There was a thick fog in the early morning in the imperial capital, and the street lamps were only the size of bean dots in the fog. Viscount Kilkenny Baron, a plain-looking young man, whose only credit was to lead the military police and gang members in an unrestricted fighting competition in the slums, killed 2 gang members and took them away. A dozen innocent civilians. In the end, the Vienna district court ruled that he had derelict in his duties and revoked his position as captain of the gendarmerie and sent him to prison for 13 months. Speaking of prisons in Europe, they are really a good place for enlightenment. After losing his job, he quickly packaged his growth experience and the so-called experience he accumulated, and then compiled it into a book called History Will Prove My Innocence. Unless they make a huge mistake, it is generally difficult for nobles with titles in Austria to enter. Of course, even in prison, Viscount Baron was well cared for. What he met were either polite jailers or talented inmates. This kind of treatment was by no means something ordinary people could easily enjoy. Next door lived an economist who liked to study opera. It was John Bumbork who had cheated on a bet with Franz. This also starts with $1 million gambling game that demonstrated the unreasonableness of loan sharking. As one of the participants, Bumbork thought of cheating because he was unable to repay the debt he owed. As expected, he got into trouble. Of course, he would not and would not dare to resent the future prince because he bullied the weak and feared the strong. Instead, he felt that the culprits who deceived him were the Jews. Viscount Baron and this literary economist hit it off right away. After enthusiastic exchanges and discussions, both parties came to a common conclusion that the national and economic chaos was entirely caused by those lower races with corrupt morals. The empire is filled with all kinds of Slavs, Italians, Jews, Hungarians, etc. There are too many bad guys, so good guys like them have no place. The Germans must use their own swords to plow the land for themselves. Only by restoring the Holy Roman Empire and allowing Germans to govern this country can true peace be achieved. After being released from prison, the two became a pair of close comrades in arms, actively traveling around to promote greater Germanism. At first, there was no difference between what they did and what Franz did. They just helped each other to help the ethnic brothers affected by the disaster. Therefore, the organization developed steadily and did not attract the attention of the latter. After all, under Franz's intervention, Austria's greater German organization took root everywhere like mushrooms after a rain. But the series of events that followed, especially the railroad stock crisis, made this financier with an online IQ follow the clues and quickly figure out its general outline. The frightened Germans naturally united more easily, and the early actions gave Viscount Baron a good reputation. In addition, he found an outlet for people to vent their emotions and immediately became famous in the imperial capital. Even the University of Vienna extended an invitation to him. However, this was suppressed under the secret instruction of Franz. After all, those radical and angry young people are a powerful and unstable group. He does not want to be the second Sachnie, allowing extremism to dominate discussions and then having to use stupid force to solve it. Moreover, Austria is not Hungary. Its population, Financial resources, technology, and military strength are not comparable to the latter once such a destructive storm blows up. Even a wise man will have difficulty stopping it, so letting this person evaporate from the world becomes an inevitable choice point at this moment. Even the thick fog could not hide the arrogance and complacency exuding from Baron. He had just left the bar and brothel called Golden Memories with great success. There was not a single soul on the street, but the smell of death was hidden everywhere in the vast fog. But the Viennese star didn't notice at all. You must know that at the moment, he is a guest in the salons and dances of those high-ranking big shots who cannot afford to fawn over. Even his immediate superiors who once frightened him now have an ugly look of bowing down. Baron, who had worked hard day and night, staggered towards the carriage parked not far away. The coachman, who had been waiting for a long time, was concentrating on removing the pedals from the carriage so that the Viscount could board the carriage. Just when everything seemed to be proceeding steadily, a man wearing a cap and a trench coat quickly walked out of the thick fog and bumped into the former. Watch the road, idiot. Do you know who you hit? Seeing Viscount Baron being knocked to the ground, the coachman immediately chased after him and cursed, but the other party ignored him and quickly disappeared into the mist. Damn guy. He can run fast. The coachman thought that his brave behavior would be favored by the distinguished guests. When he was about to go over and help the Viscount, who was drunk on the ground, he was shocked by the scene in front of him. I saw a dagger stuck in his chest, and blood flowed from the wound, and dyed the white shirt red. Viscount Baron. Viscount Baron Kilkenny. Baron looked around unwillingly, exhaled the last breath of his life forcefully, and then closed his eyes forever with his dreams. Perhaps it was because there was a noisy bar next to it where countless young men and women were reveling, but no one responded to the coachman's shouts. After glancing at the gold ring and gold pocket watch on the dead Viscount Baron, he couldn't control the greed in his heart. After confirming that the other party had died, the light that was like a dot in the fog also disappeared. The coachman put the above valuable items into his pocket without blushing, and then carried the body onto the carriage. He drove non-stop all the way to the home of the doctor he knew, but it was too late, and a newly ignited star had died. Once this kind of grassroots organization loses its leader, it will naturally collapse, and the murderer will certainly not be able to escape justice. After a search by detectives and gendarmes, the deceased's belongings were found on the driver's body and a large amount of blood was found in the car. Therefore, based on their own experience, they came to the conclusion that they wanted to kill their distinguished passengers because of their wealth. As for sending Viscount Baron to the doctor's residence, it was completely a cover-up, and the thief shouted to catch the thief. The natural ending was that the coachman was sent to prison. Of course, with the help of Franz, he was spared the death penalty and switched to digging coal in the mines. No one will seek justice for a dead man, even if he once made the world move. The only memory those former fans have of Viscount Baron is a $0 purchase at a Jewish store. The Vienna police originally wanted to stand by and watch as they did in the past, but by chance, Archduke Franz's car happened to be passing by. Gendarmerie and police quickly launched a force to arrest all possible dangerous element, including some shopkeepers and clerks who looked ugly, vicious or were physically strong. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. His Royal Highness, Kilkenny Baron was murdered by his own coachman. A Jenny smiled and handed over a newspaper. Give some money to his survivors as compensation. Franz said lightly. You know, there is also a Viscount Baron in Hungary. A Jenny reminded. Of course he knew what the other party was referring to, but the two situations were different, and they couldn't be solved by the same method. You mean the Magyarists? Yes, the plans of this group of people may deserve our attention more than Viscount Baron's demands, although a Jenny doesn't like the idea of dividing people into 3, 6, or 9 classes. It is much better than the idea of the great Magyarists who want to eliminate and enslave other ethnic groups according to this Viscount's classification. The first class is Germans, the second class is Hungarians, the third and fourth classes are Czechs and Poles, the fifth class is South Slavs, the sixth class is the remaining Slavs, and the seventh class is Northern Italy. The 8th class of people are Jews, and the 9th class are Gypsies. Although the Poles are not on the top 3 flags, they can still be ranked 4th. But if the Magyars gain power, then she can only choose to accept being completely assimilated by them, or simply not be a human being. The So-called Great Magyar Kingdom is just their delusion, but the Germans are different. Franz's words sent shivers down a Janna's spine. Chapter 344 Wine. People should eat less. Because when people are hungry, they have only one worry. But when they are full, they will have countless troubles. In the final analysis, things in this world are mostly just about being full. The greatest governor in the world, unify. There are many ways to divide the hierarchy of human needs, the most famous of which is Maslow's 5-level theory. He divided human needs into physiological needs, safety needs, social needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization needs. Maslow believes that physiological needs are the lowest level that people pursue. They are the most primitive and most basic requirements that people need, such as eating, drinking, clothing, and housing. This can be said to be the bottom line for maintaining a country. Once one or more of people's physiological needs cannot be met, the country will be unstable and even an uprising will break out. This is both an inevitable demand and a huge driving force for public action. It is also the bottom line. Many ancient rulers in history were good at taking advantage of this. They created one structure after another that was internally unbreakable in order to last for thousands of years and keep their country strong. It is a pity that all those dynasties were easily invaded by foreign enemies after losing all the dividends of their predecessors. There are countless examples of elites collectively rebelling. The most typical one is Mexico, a country that once had the same opportunities as the United States and even had better resource allocation than the United States. In the end, the elite collectively surrendered to the drug traffickers. Secondly, there is the need for security. People want to have stable jobs and stable income, and their lives and property can be guaranteed, and they can be protected from disasters and wars. At least not the one who is being massacred, but whether it is a 5-level classification, a 7-level classification, a 9-level classification, or a 3-level classification. Food and clothing, well-off, and wealthy, physiological needs are people's primary needs. Although it was nice to kill all the enemies and defeat all the heroes, it was not what Franz really wanted. If he could, he would still be willing to help more people, even if future generations would say that Franz was not a hero, and would not hesitate to erase his achievements. Bohemia, Pilsen. In 1516. Duke William IV of the Principality of Bavaria promulgated the beer purity law in Germany, which stipulated that beer in Germany could only be made with 4 raw materials: barley malt, hops, water and yeast. This was the first time in human history that beer was defined in the form of law, but by today in 1842, this decree was obviously not appropriate. Industrialization has penetrated into all fields, and the beer industry is no exception. The emergence of Pilsner beer in Bohemia represents the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the beer industry. The German part of Austria was subject to the purity law, however there was a large amount of land in the empire that was not subject to this law. In fact, the main purpose of the Purity Beer Act is to collect taxes, not to make beer taste better or be safer to eat as later generations thought. One of the biggest drawbacks of the beer purity law is that it makes the beer in Germany taste monotonous and severely restricts the development of the beer industry. The reason is very simple. To be able to brew beer, you must first have grain, and it must be fine grain. It is difficult for people who are not nobles or wealthy landowners to do this. This eliminates a large number of possible competitors and of course kills them with their own hands. A lot of possibilities. This is also an important reason why the beer revolution did not break out in the historic German region, but in the Austrian province of Bohemia. In 1842, several well-known brewers, including Joseph Fuggerl, were hired by Franz with a lot of money to complete the Pilsner beer that transcended the times. At the same time, he also invited a young man from France, Louis Pasteur. Different from traditional ale and porter, in the traditional ale process, the yeast is in the upper layer of the wort, and the temperature required for fermentation is slightly higher, usually 10-20 deg C. After fermentation, there is no further processing. This kind of beer is easy to sour and has a short shelf life. It is fine for ordinary guests in the pub, but it is a nightmare for sailors sailing on the sea. Moldy food, algae-infested drinking water and sour beer, as well as rats and maggots everywhere, made sailors miserable in the early 19th century. Pilsner beer uses a new lager process. The yeast is in the lower layer of the wort, and the temperature required for fermentation is low, generally below 10 °C. After fermentation, it can be filtered and pasteurized, which can greatly extend the shelf life of the beer, unlike traditional ale beer which has a shelf life of only 10 days, and then becomes sour beer. Even the porter beer, that the British are proud of, has a shelf life of less than 3 months. While specially processed Pilsner beer can be stored for more than a year at the same time, the industrialization of Pilsner beer has a huge advantage. It can not only use traditional malt, hops and water to brew, but also use various cheap raw materials such as rice, corn, starch, cassava, sucrose, rye and so on. This can not only save costs, but also greatly enrich the taste of beer. As for the low alcohol content and slightly light taste, it is in line with the requirements of the emerging bourgeoisie to drink without getting drunk. In contrast to the traditional ale process or porter process, brewing must use malt, hops, yeast and water. Not only is the cost of brewing wine high, but it also places strict requirements on workers, otherwise it will be extremely difficult to ensure quality. Even beers produced by the same brewery often have huge differences in taste. Therefore, for a long time, beer was regarded as a drink that was not on the table. In fact, breweries do not guarantee the quality of traditional beer regardless of brewing costs. On the contrary, in order to increase production and enrich the taste, brewers have continued to add weird things such as horse urine, soteria, and beech to beer for centuries. As for the matter of watering down, it is simply basic and there is no need to explain it in detail. The advantage of industrialized Pilsner beer is that the fermentation time is short, usually 1 week, while traditional beer takes 1 to 2 months, or even longer. Not only is it time consuming and laborious, but the quality cannot be guaranteed. Finally, and the biggest advantage, is the price. As the first beer producing country before the 19th century, the price of beer in Austria is already very low. The price of each pot, per pint, is usually 5 groschen, which is equivalent to 0.166 florins, and the cost is about 3 grains. Eluocean left and right. After a series of reforms, the cost of Pilsner beer can be reduced to less than 1 groschen. The huge price difference was enough for France to beat all the beer merchants in North Germany to death. At this time, the beer production of the Austrian Empire ranked second in the world, with 1.396 billion liters per year, more than Britain and France combined. Slightly less than the total of other member states of the German Confederation of 1.589 billion liters. However, although the beer industrial revolution occurred in Austria in history, it was eventually carried forward in the United Kingdom and the United States. Franz was not about to repeat the mistakes of the past, and he wanted to introduce the beer of the Austrian Empire to the world. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 345 Wine Road. The Pilsner beer made by Franz is far superior to the Pilsner beer in history, both in terms of brewing process and shelf life. Joseph Fugrell, a Bavarian brewer, was involved in almost the entire design of Pilsner beer, but he only had no idea why its shelf life was so long. This is a given, as pasteurization was not introduced until 1862 by Louis Pasteur. The principle is to take advantage of the reproduction characteristics of bacteria and use appropriate temperature and holding time to kill them all, so as to extend the shelf life. Franz respected Pasteur as a great biologist, so the secret about pasteurization was not hidden from him. On the contrary, Franz sincerely invited the other party to study in Vienna, but Pasteur flatly refused. Through what you have seen and heard in Vienna during this period, you should understand that the center of the future scientific community must be in Austria. And with my support, your future research path will go smoothly, Franz. is not good at dealing with scientists because he always feels that their thinking is too divergent and they always think of some messy things, but generally speaking, if you present facts and make sense, this routine still works. Thank you for your long love, Archduke Franz. I have indeed seen a lot during my time in Vienna. Especially the research on invisible creatures has benefited me a lot, but for your invitation, I still please allow me to refuse. Pasteur was so certain that it seemed beyond doubt. Science knows no borders. Impostor. Those arrogant fools in Paris do not recognize your true talents. In fact, Pasteur had just turned 20 years old at this time, and after graduating from middle school, he became a teaching assistant at Mount Busang Middle School, which was extremely rare at the time. However, his path to university was not smooth. It was not until August 1843, when he was 21 years old, that Pasteur was admitted to the École Normale Supérieure in Paris to study teaching methods in chemistry and physics. Franz's condition was that, if Pasteur was willing to come to Austria, he could choose any university in the Austrian Empire and study any course he wanted. Not only would the royal family bear all of Pasteur's expenses, but they were also willing to give him an annuity of 5,000 florins per year. At the same time, Pasteur will be invited by the Royal Scientific Society of Vienna and become the youngest member of this organization since its establishment. Science has no national boundaries, and scientists have their own motherland. Pasteur's answer surprised Franz. After all, the latter always thought that this sentence should be said by a Chinese, but in fact it was Louis Pasteur who first said this sentence. Austria and France have been feuding for centuries, and this contradiction has long been integrated into the blood of all classes on both sides. As a nationalist, it was impossible for Pasteur to serve for his mortal enemy, the Austrian Empire, but Franz respected his choice and did not stop him. In fact, it is extremely easy to make a person disappear in Vienna with Franz's energy, let alone a foreigner. Jenny walked in and saw Franz looking lost and said, "Have you fallen out of love?" This made Franz very embarrassed. After all, most scientists in this era had poor living conditions, and he usually only needed to pay a very small price to persuade him to succeed. It seems that the conflict between France and Austria is deeper than I thought. Franz didn't want to answer, so Ajani couldn't continue teasing her, so she followed Franz's words. The two families of Habsburg and Bourbon, from the earliest sacrilege league to the 30 Years' War of Religion and the French Revolution. The contradiction between the two parties cannot be explained clearly in one or two sentences. Correct. If you are shameless enough, you can even see Catholic countries in the Protestant Union. France is truly worthy of its reputation as a filial son of the Catholic Church. In fact, Pasteur's words just now made Franz fall into deep thought. He began to doubt whether he had the ability to turn the tide in this national era. Maintaining the decency of a universal empire seemed so out of reach again. Looking at Franz's thoughtful look, Ajani felt that now was not a good time to talk about things. In fact, the previous Mr. Pasteur was not a difficult figure to deal with. In Ajani's eyes, the way he looked at himself, zooming in, lowering his head, and walking away suddenly, was completely the behavior of an innocent little boy. In other words, he was just a young child. Judging from Ajani's many years of experience, as long as she finds an experienced lover, let alone her country, it won't be a problem to let him kill her biological parents. Of course, she wouldn't do that without Franz's order, because Ajani can see that Franz respects her very much. Although her method is feasible, it is too despicable and may cause Franz's dissatisfaction. She came here to report to Franz on the sales and promotion of Pilsner beer. There is no doubt that this cheap beer is very marketable. Franz set the price at 3 groschen, which alone has already firmly strangled the throat of traditional ale beer. In fact, Ajani didn't understand why she didn't just lower the price to 2 groschen. In this way, the beer industry in Austria and even Germany can be completely unified. At this time, no country can compete with Austria in the beer industry. Even if a country secretly learns this technology later, Austria can still rely on its strong strength and influence to make the other party pay a considerable patent fee. Franz naturally has his own considerations. If the price is set too low, profits may be reduced. At the same time, when a large amount of cheap wine enters the market, it will inevitably cause bad money to drive out good money. Although the quality of Pilsner beer is stable, Franz does not deny that some ales are better than the former, and Franz didn't want to offend all the beer merchants. After all, rabbits would bite people when they were anxious, let alone a group of living people. As a time traveler, Franz knows well that the smell of wine is also afraid of the depth of the alley. So after the development of Pilsner beer was completed, he handed over the promotion work to a Janny. In fact, Franz himself is a good billboard, but he and his friends are just a group of 12 or 3-year-old boys at this time. It's not good if you drink in a group and cause something difficult to end. Although beer at that time had the reputation of liquid bread, it was actually still a poor man's drink that was not on the market. A Jenny placed the beer in the Royal Department Store in the store near the train station. The former is to increase the popularity of this beer. After all, the quality is usually not much worse with the royal endorsement. The latter is to sell wine, because with the development of railways and industry, a large number of workers will travel to various parts of the country via railways, and they are the main force consuming beer. Of course, the military is also a good sign. Because Pilsner beer has a long shelf life, it is very suitable for maritime voyages. Therefore, the Austrian Imperial Navy sent a large number of orders to the brewery, but those soldiers would not really keep the wine at sea and drink it again. They drank the slow alcohol beer as water. Friedrich liked this low alcohol wine very much. According to his own words, "We don't have to sail around the sea with a bunch of drunken drunkards at last." But, in fact, low alcohol will not solve the problem of soldiers getting drunk, because they will drink more than before. The army also praised the Pilsner beer developed by Franz. You must know that wine and sugar were important guarantees for the morale of the army during this period. Not only is this so-called Pilsner beer cheap, it also has a long shelf life. This made the generals of the War Department find it very useful. At the call of Count Latter, it became a must-have for military banquets. In fact, the military is a group that is relatively easy to satisfy. After all, they can even enjoy the super unpleasant instant coffee, let alone the refreshing beer. Now, the instant coffee at this time was far from the taste of later generations. According to the description of the military officer at the time, the damn stuff was like a mixture of pebbles and sawdust, and it tasted so bitter and astringent that it made you sick. But, in fact, among the Austrian Imperial Army at this time, ordinary soldiers were still very satisfied with instant coffee. First of all, it has a refreshing effect. Secondly, this kind of coffee is not troublesome and can be brewed as long as there is hot water, especially for the soldiers of the border army. This kind of coffee is really a gift from God. What they lack most when performing patrol missions in the wild is time. Faced with massive orders from the army, Franz had to expand production capacity. Soon Pilsner beer became one of the pillar industries of Bohemia, and also led to the development of a series of surrounding industries. For example, in the glass manufacturing industry, Austria at this time was the largest glass exporter in the world. Pilsner beer differs from traditional ales in that it has a longer shelf life. This means that it can be packaged independently, and Bohemia happens to be the largest glass manufacturing center in Austria, so the conditions are unique. As Austrian beer made its way into the German Confederation, the German states, led by Prussia, began to oppose this kind of beer that violated the Beer Purity Act. Prussia, Bavaria and other countries felt that Austria's approach was against the spirit of the German customs union, while Austria insisted that Bohemia was an integral part of Austria. But it did not belong to Austria when the pure beer law was enacted, so it should not comply with this law. Faced with calls from German states to kick Bohemia out of the German customs union, the local Germans who had been bewitching the Czechs to become independent finally stopped. The German aristocrats of Bohemia advocate Czech nationalism all day long, just because independence can bring them greater benefits. But if independence would cause Bohemia to leave the German customs union, then they would never do it. After all, the profits brought by the German customs union are too huge. Of course, not everyone can react Some German nobles who have fooled themselves really feel that the Czechs should be independent. Although they were all Czechs, the Czechs in Moravia expressed deep concerns about leaving the Austrian Empire. Although Moravia did not benefit as much as Bohemia from the German Zollverein, many local industries relied on the platform of the Austrian Empire. If they left the empire, they might be nothing. Due to the transportation costs of this era, France's desire to dominate the beer industry fell through, but since then, all ships sailing on the sea will carry Pilsner beer. In fact, once people's living standards improve, the consumption of beer, a drink, will surge. At this time, the beer production capacity was far behind Austria's development speed, and of course its consumption of food was also huge. For this reason, France had to consider continuing to reform agriculture. Chemical fertilizers are the foundation of modern agriculture, but ammonium sulfate was obviously too backward, so Liebig and his assistants developed potassium fertilizer. Historically, this potash fertilizer was not developed until 1850, but at this time, due to Franz's intervention, it was advanced 8 years. But Franz is still not satisfied. He has a golden plan in mind. Mr. Liebig, since you think nitrogen is so important for plant growth, why don't you just develop nitrogen fertilizers? Franz's words made him think deeply. Indeed, using nitrogen directly as fertilizer can definitely greatly increase crop yields. Liebig was an undoubted chemical genius, and his ideas and discoveries fit well with Franz's plan. He believed that plant growth requires inorganic substances such as carbonic acid, ammonia, magnesium oxide, phosphorus, nitric acid, and compounds of potassium, sodium, and iron. Human and animal excrement can only be absorbed by plants if it is converted into carbonic acid, ammonia and nitric acid. These views are the basis of modern agricultural chemistry. He also believed that animal food not only needs a certain amount, but also needs various types, organic or inorganic, and must have a considerable proportion. The principle of fermentation is also proposed. He strongly advocated the use of inorganic fertilizers to improve harvests, which was particularly rare in this era. 1842, South Africa. The British Cape Colony in South Africa annexed the new Boer Republic established by the Boers. Of course, the official explanation given was to protect white South Africans from the abuses of the two black countries, the Ndebele and the Zulu. But in fact, it was just to avoid being involved in the dispute. Total war is necessary. But in fact the Boers had long complained that the British were not tough on the Xhosa on the eastern frontier of the Cape Colony. The Xhosa people are actually the indigenous people of South Africa. Strictly speaking, they are not a nation, but the name given by the British and Boers to all local black people who disobey their rule. In recent history, the Xhosa people have waged a series of wars to protect their land and prevent white invaders from further raiding their homeland. These primitive tribes were very brave and even captured a British warship. However, these nomads living on the grasslands had nothing to do with these giant beasts floating on the sea, and ultimately had to return without success. The Xhosa people have been holding on to this weak but brave resistance until the appearance of a liar wizard truly broke down their resistance. This wizard named Mohorokiza spread false prophecies that he could defeat the British through sacrifices, which eventually led to hundreds of thousands of Xhosa people starving to death. After that, the severely weakened Xhosa people could no longer pose any effective threat to the colonists, and eventually had to live in reservations designated by the British, ending up with the same fate as the Indians in North America. Chapter 346 The Uneasy Year. 1842 was destined to be an uneasy year. The story of Austria's victory over the Zouaves and pirates in the Western Indian Ocean quickly spread throughout Europe. You must know that their reputation in the Age of Discovery was no less than that of the Barbary pirates who roamed the Mediterranean. However, what European countries are more interested in is that the Oman Empire actually gave the entire Tanzania coast, including Bagamoyo, to the Austrian Empire. Due to the strength of the Oman Empire, East Africa has always been a restricted area for European powers. The behavior of the Oman Empire was obviously showing weakness to the Austrian Empire. No powerful country would believe the stupid idea of handing over its territory to others. In order to express gratitude, there can only be one reason, and that is that the Oman Empire is not as good as the Austrian Empire. This will naturally make Britain and France tempted, and they have long coveted the port of Mombasa. Mombasa, a city once founded by the Portuguese, is now the largest trading center in East Africa. Especially after the Austrian Empire acquired Bagamoyo, the slave trade center in East Africa, or the world moved to Mombasa. Moreover, compared to Bagamoyo, Mombasa port has a larger throughput and a more advantageous geographical location. It is surrounded by natural barriers formed by natural coral rocks, making it a military fortress that is easy to defend and difficult to attack. Of course, the idea that the Oman Empire gave the Tanzania coastline to the Tanzania coastline in gratitude for the actions of Franz and his party was completely fabricated by said to cover up the fact that he was weak after his defeat. But what he didn't expect was that the trick he thought was so sophisticated could be seen through so easily. Fortunately, the Oman Empire still has its remaining power, and Britain and France only made tentative requests. After the disastrous defeat to the Austrian Empire, Said finally recognized his own strength, and he had dealt with the French before, so he naturally used checks and balances at this time. The conflicts between Britain and France were much greater than in history. Starting from the Spanish Civil War and then to Central America, the British caused the French to suffer huge losses every time. If Gizzard was not a pro-British man in power at this time, I'm afraid that the contradiction between the two countries would further intensify. But even he could hardly suppress the anger of the people. Especially in Central America, the French paid a huge price to participate in the Central American Civil War, while the British took away Honduras, a land rich in gold and silver, without firing a shot or spending a cent. What's even more outrageous is that the British sent people to secretly rescue the former president of Central America, Morazan, and secretly gave him support to oppose French rule. In fact, bribery is very common in this era. Just like France clearly wanted Mills to never stand up again, but the British were able to rescue him easily. Of course, this would require the help of a traitor, otherwise the FBI, KGB, Chinese Dragon Group and the like in later generations would really be ashamed. Morazan also lived up to expectations. He chose the Saldoba area as soon as he escaped. This is his foundation. Coupled with the poor mountains and rivers and the many unruly people here, it is the weakest place of French rule. As a result, the French had just ended the costly civil war in Central America, and were now facing Morazan's rebellion. Of course, Morazan would not call himself a villain. In his eyes, the French betrayed him. Then the second edition of Central America's Anti-Thieves was officially released. The level was still as low as ever, and the content was even more mediocre. In fact, it was just gossiping and misrepresenting it. The general idea is that the French betrayed the Declaration of Human Rights and came together with the church, and as Napoleon's successor, he wanted to do what Napoleon failed to do, overthrow the monarchy and restore the republic. Lamartine said that he had made a mistake by inviting the French here. They would have wasted their food and money, and would have colluded with those damn rebels. If he had accomplished the great cause of unification without the French disrupting him, today's situation would not have happened. For this reason, Lamartine gave anyone the right to kill Frenchmen and priests in Central America. He wanted to fight for freedom and people. Lamartine's words made the French senior officials angry. You must know that the amount of money they have spent on the Central American Federation Civil War over the years can be described in astronomical figures. Even compared to the previous Spanish Civil War, the French church also felt wronged. They decided to help after seeing the Central American priests being slaughtered by both sides. But now, they have become the executioners who kill ordinary people. The Bonapartists in France were even more furious. This was the first time they had seen a counterfeit being so arrogant. Louis Napoleon in Arkham prison couldn't help but want to jump out and hack this bastard to death, asking him what qualifications he had to inherit Napoleon's career. "Are you worthy of being called Napoleon?" Faced with Louis Napoleon sleep talking, the inmates and jailers said they were used to it. After all, he was not sick for a day or two. At this time, Victor Hugo and the banker Barrero brothers, who were imprisoned for satirizing the church, had been released from prison. Frank Miller, the police chief who used excessive violence, slept with each other in a hideous manner. A young man wearing clown makeup was carefully reading the book Abolition of Poverty written by Louis Napoleon, and making strange laughter from time to time, while the mysterious killer goo from the east was still hanging upside down in the room. On the beam, no one knew whether he was asleep or awake. Countries and parties involved who have some knowledge of the wars in Central America know how many bad things Morrison has done, but for the vast number of melon-eating people on the European continent, this is undoubtedly a big black hole in France. For a time, there was endless condemnation of the French king and government, and almost everyone accused them of greed and cruelty. After all, the victims this time were white people, not other people of color. In fact, the French really want to remove the thorn in their side of Morrison, but because El Salvador is a mountainous swamp, and is close to the Pacific Ocean, and not connected to the Atlantic Ocean, the Panama Canal has not yet been opened at this time. If they want to invade from the sea, they must bypass it. In South America, no one can afford such a price point. Attacking from land is equally costly. But we can't let it go, not only because Morrison betrayed France, but also brought a very bad influence to it. It is also because of the difficult terrain of Soldoba that it is the best springboard to attack Guatemala. There is no room for others to snore and sleep on the side of the bed. Of course, the French want to get along quickly. But soon they discovered new troubles, because Morrison was able to make a comeback, because there were people behind the scenes. It's just that this is not a British family. Americans are also involved. They hope that Morrison will unify the Central American Federation again. This is not because the Americans really want to help them, but a chaotic Central America is more beneficial to the United States, at least not allowing the great powers to take root in Central America. Of course, in addition to Americans, there are also Mexicans, who naturally do not want the French to take root here, because once the French power stabilized in Central America, it formed a double teaming trend against Mexico. Tazanana did not think that he could defeat the French. Even Austria had to support Morrison with 1 million florins. This was not because Franz wanted to stir up trouble, but because he was afraid of being bitten by the mad dog Morrison, so he had to pay a share of the money. Chapter 347 Graduation Ceremony, July 20th, 1842. Vienna, Royal Academy for Women. Today, the college was extremely noisy, but no one stopped it. Because today is a day when the first class of graduates of the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna graduates. No one wants to do anything to ruin the atmosphere on this memorable day. The school cafeteria is filled with the graduates' works. Because they are leaving school, they hope to make more food to feed the poor professors. 4. The girls' weekly cooking classes are an opportunity to feed their pets. However, there is a huge gap in the quality of these students' works. Franz will not let those precious talents risk their lives casually, even if they suffer from diarrhea. The school staff will conduct a food taste test first, and only if the taste and toxicity are satisfactory will the professors eat it. A large amount of inferior products and unloved food will be sent to nearby garrison camps, and the last leftovers will be used to help the poor. Food that was rated as inferior in school became a delicacy to reward soldiers in the army. After all, cooks in this era were divided into ordinary cooks and army cooks. Ordinary cooks were there to cook, while army cooks just wanted to cook things. At that time, there was a well-received food among the Austrian Imperial Army called vegetable broth. The recipe was very simple. Just put vegetables, beans, meat, and seasonings into a large pot and cook it. Don't be surprised if you find pigskins with hair on them, unwashed vegetable leaves, muddy peas, unidentifiable meat and strange bugs, because the soldiers around you have long been accustomed to it. Of course, the food left after leaving the army not only looks unpalatable, but also tastes terrible. It is too spicy, too bitter, too sour, too salty, too cold, and too hard. There is always one or more of them. If you really can't live, or you are hungry, you won't eat this kind of food. Generally speaking, recipients are not allowed to take away food, because it is easy to create a chain of interests. In that case, the relief itself would become an evil deed. Franz was not a virgin, but he did not want to be a hypocrite. Since he had done something, he had to do it well. But at this time, the Austrian Empire was booming, especially in the imperial capital of Vienna, where there were almost no cases of survival, so the remaining food was often brought back to feed pigs, and serve as fertilizer of course. This is exactly what Franz wants to see. He hopes that those leftovers will never be cared for. That is the best proof of the strength of an empire. Speaking of graduation, taking a group photo is indispensable. Cameras were still a new thing at this time, so when I heard that the school would take free photos for all graduates, even those who were arrogant all day long couldn't help but be excited. In 1839, Daguerre successfully trial produced the daguerreotype camera, marking the birth of the world's first camera. The camera at this time was very bulky and easily damaged, so it took two professionals to move it. At the same time, because the daguerreotype photosensitive film requires high light brightness and long photosensitivity time, taking pictures has become a very painful experience. In order to record beautiful moments, people have to endure hard for more than 10 minutes or even dozens of times under the scorching sun on a sunny day minutes to get a photo. But fortunately, the Austrian Empire was the first country in the world to develop a condenser lens. Historically, in 1841, a mathematics professor at the University of Vienna designed the famous Petzval lens on his own. Because of his hardships, however, in this life, Petzval joined the Royal Scientific Society of Vienna and completed the design in 1840 with the help of other experts. Not long ago, they completed a piece of research that almost shocked Franz, and that was silver halide technology. You must know that silver halide emulsion plus gelatin base is what Kodak started. In addition, technologies such as wet colloid tincture plate and wet negative sulfonated silver photographic paper photography method have also been developed like mushrooms after a rain. Sure enough, eating, drinking and having fun are the fundamental driving force of human beings. Soon they tinkered with a camera that was unique in the world. It weighed only 1/10 of an ordinary camera, but its light transmittance was dozens of times that of other cameras. 10 minutes, but this camera only takes a few seconds. Several professional photographers didn't know what to say when faced with a girl who had been preparing to hold the same pose for more than 10 minutes. When the girls discovered how easy it was to take pictures, they all became more playful and went around to choose a scene to take pictures. Photographers in this era are all big names in the true sense. Not only do they need to have professional and excellent skills, but they also need a certain amount of capital to afford cameras and films. Naturally, they would not agree to such rude requests, but the order was given by Archduke Franz, and they did not dare to neglect it. And this new camera is so amazing that they want to spend all their money to buy one. But in fact, this new camera uses so much advanced technology that if you really buy one, you will definitely lose your money. Franz also promised these photographers that he would give each of them one in a few years. The price of cameras at this time was too high, not because of material cost, but because of labor cost plus technology cost, which made the price ridiculously high. Once industrialized production is implemented, costs will drop sharply. Of course, in order to maintain scarcity and sufficient profits, prices still cannot be set to low. Graduation season is also a day for breakups and confessions, but some situations are different from what Franz thought. There was almost no teacher-student love, but a group of girls cried and laughed and argued endlessly. Franz looked at Principal Failure beside him. Don't look at me. I didn't make them look like that. Don't you always say that love lasts for a long time? It's normal for them to have some feelings during the few years they have been together. Of course Thalia knew what Franz was going to say, and she would not take the blame. However, during her years as a principal, she still understood some ways of the world, and did not directly put all the blame on Franz, like she did in the past, or just say what Franz wants to say. In fact, Franz is still a little skeptical. After all, there is a lesbian principal who might lead a group of students into trouble. Well, let's hope this school doesn't become some club or something. How dare you say that? If I hadn't stopped them, the happy people in the city would have turned this place into their playground. As the principal, Taylor usually dealt with harassment cases from nobles and wealthy young men. Fortunately, she had the backing of the royal family, and she was also aggressive enough so that those noble young men were afraid of them. This kind of thing can only be left to Thalia. Jenna's handling of this kind of thing depends entirely on her mood. If she is in a good mood, she will trick people into trying to survive, but if she is in a bad mood, they may be directly physically obliterated. Point of course, there is still a certain chance that she will collude with others. Franz suddenly felt that there were not many useful people around him. The Zhu Qiangying whom he met in Nanyang before was very determined, but it was a pity that she did not speak German, and Nanyang was inseparable from people, so he had no choice but to give up. Oshio Shanayan had completed middle school at this time and graduated with the first grade in the school. The teachers in the school spoke very highly of her and called her the smartest lower person, but for Franz, she was still not enough. Chapter 348 What to do after graduation. Royal Academy for Women in Vienna. This is the list of graduates, 135 in the middle school and 370 in the elementary school. Thalia took out 2 lists and handed them to Franz. The academic system at this time was very confusing. The Royal College for Women temporarily adopted a 4-year system, with 4 years of primary school, 4 years of secondary school, and 4 years of university. Primary school focuses on literacy, supplemented by home economics, etiquette, loyalty to the emperor and patriotism. Middle schools focus on popularizing general knowledge. Students can choose 3 subjects including home economics, family affairs management, as their majors. However, German, mathematics and home economics are usually chosen. After all, for women living in the Austrian Empire in this era, these 3 doors are more practical. Other auxiliary courses such as communication, art, music, dance, literature, etc. will also be gradually opened, of course, such as natural sciences, medicine, law, mechanical engineering, and theology. Of course, not everyone is perfect. During the exam, they will only take 3 majors and 3 minors. Of course, there are also many people like Ayusha Shanayan who choose more than a dozen subjects. As for whether you can understand it or stick to it, it's hard to say. In fact, in short, judging from the level of knowledge and content learned by these high school graduates, they are of no help to Franz's plan. So Franz unintentionally showed some contempt, which made Thalia very unhappy. After all, she used to be the former's tutor and part-time nanny. At this time, Thalia felt like a mother struggling to prepare a large table of dishes, while the child was chewing snacks and saying that she was not hungry anymore. But now times have changed. She is no longer the tutor living in the palace, and Franz is no longer a little girl who can be rubbed. Thalia had no choice but to ask Franz patiently, "What are you going to ask them to do?" Although there is a shortage of people everywhere in this country, there are not many jobs that can satisfy them or match their status. During this period, aristocratic women hardly participated in work, so female workers not only had a low social status, but also had very few types of jobs, usually divided into 4 categories. The first category is farm work. This scope is very wide, including but not limited to carrying water and manure, washing and milking cows. In some areas, there is a small male labor force, and women have to help with plowing, weeding, fertilizing and other tasks. The second category is entering the factory. They are the female textile workers known to everyone in later generations. They work in front of the machines day and night for a mouthful of food, until they are involved in the machines or die suddenly on the roadside. The third category is to be a servant. At that time, it was very common for noble families to hire maids. If they had skills, they could get higher wages as cooks, but hotels at that time would not allow female chefs, because the mainstream thinking in society at the time was that women could not cook, and hiring female chefs was disrespectful to guests. The upper and lower limits of this industry are very outrageous. There are many people who can succeed in becoming mistresses in the end, but there are also many people who end up being inferior to black slaves. The fourth category is those like Talia who are tutors. Such women are usually well educated and have a relatively good background, but they often have to fend for themselves due to some changes such as military officers, missionaries, or orphans or widows of ocean-going merchants. Although missionaries had a bad reputation, they were indeed a high-risk profession at the time. People who traveled across the ocean to preach in foreign lands usually required a lot of courage. Although female governesses earned their living Based on their ability, they are the least respected people, and many people regard them as disaster stars and aliens outside. You have to bear the glare of others, and compare you to a prostitute. Within the family, the masters and men, and even the servants, do not regard them as their own point. A plot like the one in Jean Eyre is difficult to happen in reality, because status is seriously and equal respect, love, non-existent. The possibility of skin flesh trading is quite high. Point in 19th century London, Mrs. Brown lost a gold necklace worth £25. She suspected that the governess hired by her husband had stolen it. After receiving the report, a detective confirmed Mrs. Brown's guess, and then led the military police to break in and kill the female teacher who was still sleeping. However, the string of strings was not found during the subsequent search. Lost gold necklace. Until someone found it on the garden lawn. Mrs. Brown was crying for her mistake and her uncertain future. But the detective comforted her and said, "I can't blame you. After all, no one would have thought that the cunning witch would hide the necklace in the garden." Although this is a cold joke in the 19th century, it does reflect the embarrassing situation faced by so-called tutors at that time and the distrust of society from another perspective. "We are the witches of the 19th century," a tutor wrote in her diary. This sentence should be the best reflection of their status. Of course, the above four categories are not suitable for graduates of the Royal Women's College. After all, if the first batch of graduates are allowed to do these things, I'm afraid it will greatly reduce women's willingness to receive education. Of course, if they are made unemployed, although it will not have a too bad impact, it will not achieve the purpose of publicity. Tell them that they can choose to continue their studies or work for the government as a scribe or something like that. In fact, Franz's answer was to allow those graduates to choose to enter the government as civil servants. Scribes are very common, and a large number of scribes are needed in various agencies. They need to uniformly copy information that officials consider important. At the same time, some draft documents also need to be transcribed so that they can be sent to the printing house for printing. Scribe seems to be an inconspicuous job, but in fact there have been a lot of outstanding people, and their achievements have attracted worldwide attention. Of course, one step further than a scribe is a secretary, but this is not something that middle school students can do. Of course, advanced jobs include editors, calculators and other clerical jobs. At this time, the number of civil servants in the Austrian Empire was seriously insufficient. 80,000 people was really pitiful for a large empire with a population of 38 million. After all, the number of people at the grassroots level usually determines the efficiency of policy implementation. Although the outside world and historians are crazily criticizing the Austrian Empire for having too many officials and being a sitting army, in fact France, with a population of 35 million at this time, had a civilian army of 100,000 people. According to the standards of later generations, the number of civil servants in both France and Austria was seriously insufficient. France's goal for the Austrian Empire was to expand to 400,000 people first. He did not want to be like Britain, where temporary workers were everywhere. In the end, no one responsible could be found, and everyone was crazily corrupt. The British have always been proud that their government has less than 3,000 civilian officials, but in fact, the empire on which the sun never sets is a super empire with more than 33 million kilometers of land, spanning 4 oceans, and spreading across 5 states. This number is obviously not enough. Since then, agents and temporary workers have played an extremely important role. The advantage is that the organization has been streamlined, but the disadvantage is that there is no control at all and no one to supervise. Rights are a good thing, but once they are unregulated, they become a savage beast that can swallow up people's reason and morality in an instant. As a result, the empire on which the sun never sets planted the seeds of its own decline at its most powerful moment. Franz needs to unite more people, and his government naturally needs more people. After all, only by establishing bonds of interest can the relationship be stronger. Let them become officials. Thalia looked indignant, and she immediately understood what Franz was planning. But as an official fan, Thalia was very dissatisfied with Franz's approach. She worked so hard, and ended up working as a nanny in a university. And those students can enter the imperial government and become officials directly as soon as they graduate. Although the scribe's status was not very high, he could have his own table, chair, and teacup. Thalia felt unbalanced. In fact, many officials would not be able to climb to the position she currently holds in their lifetime, and her rights and status are much higher and greater than those of ordinary officials, just like those playboys in Vienna, whom she drove away. This group of second generation and then generation people might not even be described as committing all kinds of evil. They can simply be described as extremely vicious. If ordinary officials offend them, they may not only ruin their futures, but may also lose their reputation. But Thalia's identity made this group of people dare not have any temper at all. After all, things like fighting against the royal family in the imperial capital usually can only appear in novels and people's imaginations. Thalia is Franz's tutor, and Archduke Franz is very likely to become emperor in the future, although no one believes the heroic deeds promoted by the empire's official and church officials. Besides, they are not afraid of heroes and saints. After all, good people will not kill indiscriminately, and will give them opportunities. But Archduke Franz had a biological mother who was always ready to sink into the Danube River, but everyone in Vienna knew this. Moreover, the royal family's properties are much larger than in history, and have reached a point where they can compete with the empire's finances. This is actually a good thing for the empire, but it is not a good thing for nobles and merchants, because this meant that the empire was less dependent on loans and the imperial power was greatly strengthened. I'm just a junior civil servant like Sesame Mung Bean. It's not as good as you, the principal, who can manage thousands of people. This is a senior official. Franz knew Thalia well and naturally knew what she was thinking, so he spoke to comfort her, but obviously the effect was counterproductive, and Thalia immediately poured out the bitter water. What? High official? You see, no high official goes out in a majestic manner, and is avoided by others. Look at me again. I'm harassed by a group of playboys outside all day long, and I'm also followed by a group of children in school. Besides, the thousands of people under my command, those scientists, can't even control their own laboratories, so why should I control them? Franz built some laboratories at the Royal Women's College to cover up others' eyes. After all, ordinary spies can't get in here. Even if they get in, they can be easily detected, which can prevent secrets from leaking to the greatest extent. But some experts just like to do extreme research. They are studying picric acid explosions, and they, who are engaged in building materials, also want to have a big explosion. Then one day two little girls sneaked into his laboratory and shook up the expert's cement. At night, a thief sneaked into the laboratory under cover of darkness and prepared to steal some precious experimental instruments. When the match was trying to light the candle, there was a huge explosion in the laboratory, and the school was suspended for a week. Franz knew very well that it was useless to reason with Thalia, so he changed his approach. Can you be a disciplinary committee member, commissioner of discipline inspection? Thalia looked puzzled. After all, she had never heard of such a statement. Yes, it is to check the appearance of students and priests, as well as etiquette and so on. Franz said, isn't that what the youngest does? Thalia looked scornful, but in fact she was already a little moved, and her two big black eyes were spinning rapidly. In order to prevent her from exerting her subjective initiative too much, Franz took the lead. Of course you can create your own system, but don't go too far. At least it should look reasonable on the surface. That is a deal. Thalia stretched out her hand, and Franz also stretched out his hand in desperation. The two high-fived each other as collusion. How did that go? Don't worry, it's just the two of us here. Franz looked at the other party with an indifferent expression and black lines on his head. There are not many people who meet the requirements. After all, most people don't have the awareness you mentioned. Thalia said seriously. How many people are there? Franz asked. 5 of them. 2 of them chose to graduate, and the remaining 3 will stay in school to continue their studies and help me develop my downline. Franz was very satisfied with Thalia's answer, because everything was going according to his instructions, and it was not easy to train a high-level spy. Where's the list and information? According to what you said, one copy is kept in the school's archives, and the other one is already in your hands. There are some codes that only Franz and Thalia understand. So for others, even if the information is discovered, they need to be distinguished among hundreds of people. Let the two graduates get in touch with Ajani. After all, she is the expert in this field. Okay, I will make arrangements. Alana Harrington and Misoshi Asajin. They are really excellent people who can do great things. What do you want to say? Franz asked helplessly. Will you give them a chance? Thalia looked indifferent on the surface, but in fact she was excited and scared inside. Yes, as long as they are capable enough, I will entrust them with corresponding responsibilities. Franz understood Thalia's regret. She really wanted to be an official to reform the society, but she had no chance. Even Franz cannot go against the entire ruling class. Thalia is destined to be unable to realize her ambitions. The position of President of the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna is already the largest official position that Franz can grant her, unless one day Franz becomes the emperor and lets her enter the palace to take over the position of palace steward. But Thalia herself knew very well that she was not suitable for the palace, so it was naturally impossible for Franz to harm her. As for the latecomers, Franz will try his best to make the best use of their talents. After all, what he wants is a universal empire. If he can't even accommodate a few girls, how can he possibly accommodate tens of millions of mobs? Franz hadn't seen Thalia for a long time, so he still lay down according to his childhood habit. Then she moved her position slightly, and Franz fell straight to the ground. There was still a lively scene outside, and everyone seemed to be in a carefree paradise. What they don't know is that all the gifts from fate have already been marked with a price in secret. Chapter 349. Whoever is rich is unified. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz looked at the pile of newspapers and tapped his fingers on the table. Jenny only felt funny when she saw the situation in front of her. She didn't expect that just after Viscount Baron died, so many strange people would appear in the German Confederation. Yes, in less than a year, 24 newspapers advocating for the unification of Germany appeared among the 36 member states of the German Confederation: Cologne Zeitung, Rheinische Zeitung, Aachen Zeitung, Hanover Stadtzeitung, Saxony Nation, Berlin Post. There are many well-known newspapers among them. However, Franz was not against the idea of Greater Germany, he was just opposed to the theory of racial superiority and inferiority, and he was even one of the advocates of Greater Germany. But Franz found that the direction of the wind seemed a bit strange. Thanks to the development of industrialization and the blessing of the German customs union, the capitalists in the Rhineland became the richest people in Prussia, but they did not have much political influence. Then they put forward the slogan "Whoever is rich will be unified," but in the eyes of the officials in Berlin, this was simply treason. The Rhineland was part of Prussia. Why? Because at this time the richest among the German states was obviously not Prussia, but Austria. Even the economic aggregate of the Natalina region is not comparable to that of Prussia at this time point. If someone is rich and unified, then it will be equivalent to handing over the leadership of Germany to Austria, because at this time Prussia's fiscal revenue is only about 1/3 of Austria's and less than 1/5 of France's. As a result, these capitalists who originally planned to fight for their own political interests were directly beaten into political prisoners. Of course, they blame themselves and others in order to counter the statement that whoever is rich will unify. A young man named Otto von Bismarck published an article saying, if anyone with money can unify Germany, it would be better to hand over Germany directly to Rothschild, the D family. Of course, Rothschild was alluding to the Jews. This move was extremely vicious, and it directly knocked down those liberal capitalists who claimed that whoever is rich will be united. After all, in this era, if you are looking for a scapegoat, you are right to choose gypsies and Jews. One is a liar, one is a thief, one is a werewolf, and the other is a vampire. None of them are good things anyway. Franz didn't mind Bismarck's comparison of Austria to the Jews. On the contrary, he had respect. After all, the iron-blooded prime minister was as cunning as ever in history. Miss Ajani, what's so funny? Franz looked at Ajani, who was holding a stack of documents. I am happy that the Austrian Empire has so many supporters in the German Confederation, Ajani said, and pretended to wipe away tears that she didn't have at all. Miss Ajani, I want to remind you of something. Franz said politely but not maliciously. "What's going on?" Jenny asked. "If you rub your eyes like this, your makeup will smear." As soon as Franz finished speaking, she opened the makeup box and examined it carefully in the mirror. In fact, there were 5 countries with the highest calls for the unification of Germany at this time, namely Austria, Prussia, Hanover, Bavaria, and Saxony, and Austria's support rate was higher than the last 4 combined. The reasons for this are: first, tradition. The Habsburg family was once the master of the Holy Roman Empire. Although it has been disbanded, its influence is still there, and there are always people in the aristocratic circles who are calling for its souls too. The Austrian Empire has a strong military strength. On the surface, it has a standing army of 420,000 people. This number is almost equal to the total military strength of other German countries. 3. Austria's economic strength at this time was far greater than that of the same period in history. The most striking contrast is the fiscal revenue of 350 million florins, 145 million in the same period of history, and it has penetrated into all parts of the German Confederation, affecting the interests of many people. It can even be said that once trade with the Austrian Empire stops, the German Confederation will fall into chaos. That's right, the German Confederation now enjoys Austria's cheap industrial products on the one hand, and on the other hand it has unknowingly become Austria's economic colony. Of course, it's nothing to ordinary people. On the contrary, they feel that the cost of living is lower and their lives are better than before. It's those officials who are always raising taxes crazily and don't want them to live a good life. They all turn the blame on their own government. Although there will occasionally be popular uprisings, in the absence of war, the chance of success of such uprisings is almost zero. After all, even if a family of princes cannot do it, the 5 mountain sword sect is in the same spirit, and it is difficult for one side to support it from all sides, especially with the presence of the 2 Confederate police forces, Austria and Prussia. It is really difficult for the people of the small country to change the status quo. So some people chose to live it up. Anyway, the wages and benefits in the Austrian Empire were high. If not, they could go to Hungary to work as farmers for the royal family, or go to Austria's overseas colonies to work hard. Naturally, they had no need to continue guarding their own land. 3 acres of land. Between 1838 and 1842, the number of workers and immigrants in Austria doubled every year. In 1842 alone, nearly 200,000 people immigrated to Austria, and the number of workers reached millions. 4. International influence. Except for Prussia, the remaining 4 countries are not even considered great powers, and even Prussia is the last of the great powers. Austria is different. Although no major events have occurred, almost all major events related to the fate of the continent are decided in Vienna. The Waterloo of the London Conference and the final word of the Vienna Conference gave the Germans this illusion. They felt that Russia and Britain were allies of the Austrians, and that if they wanted to unify Germany, they must have a stable external environment, which other princes simply could not achieve. But in fact, most state governments, including the Austrian Empire, opposed the unification of Germany. Starting from 1817, when students from 15 German universities gathered at Wartburg and put forward the slogan "One country, one emperor," the Austrian secret police and the Prussian secret service never stopped persecuting them. In 1830, when the cannons of the French July Revolution echoed across Germany, the Unionists were greatly encouraged. For a time, a large number of extreme incidents occurred throughout Germany, including assassinations and arson. After that came the familiar oppression phase, with Metternich unfortunately becoming the protagonist once again. Although other countries also sent troops, everyone believed that this was Metternich's conspiracy, coupled with the strict policies he formulated in Austria. The censorship system bounded to the words reactionary and suppressor. Archduke Franz, you know how annoying this is? Jenny said angrily after confirming that her makeup was indeed smooth. Really? But Baron van Tedia, who teaches etiquette, said that this can help enhance male charm. Franz said, he taught you this. Theoretically, it would be easier for men to maintain appropriate aggressiveness. In fact, Franz also thinks so. After all, his level in this area was limited in his previous life. Then, next time, Ask him what the difference is between falling in love at first sight and falling in love with him. A Jenny asked a question. Franz was speechless for a while. Chapter 350 Helmet. Berlin, Royal Palace. William IV looked at the pointed helmet he designed himself, and he liked it as much as he liked it. It's so perfect. What? A masterpiece. With a burst of boasting from the court officials, the Prussian M1842 cavalry helmet was finalized. The M1842 cavalry helmet is actually still a leather helmet, but the peak is made of metal. This design, which looks like an L inserted into the helmet, was actually designed by Frederick William IV himself. This pointed helmet, also known as a spiked helmet, was originally used to show off the masculinity and powerful combat power of the Prussians. It was indeed loved by successive Prussian emperors, and even German military leaders such as Otto von Bismarck and Paul von Hindenburg liked to pose for photos wearing spiked helmets, especially after the Franco-Prussian War. The bristling beard and spiked helmet became symbols of pride for Prussian soldiers. It's like a portrait of Bismarck, a typical painting style at that time, although William IV claimed that he was inspired by the mythical unicorn, which symbolizes loyalty and beauty. The helmet was ridiculed and caricatured nationally and internationally as soon as it came out. Heinrich considered the spiked helmet to be exaggerated and superficial, and wrote a satirical poem comparing the spiked helmet to a lightning rod. The helmet was even openly criticized in the Rheinische Zeitung newspaper. Yes, I like this helmet. It shows the highest wisdom, the inspiration of the king. I'm just afraid that when the storm hits, that romantic crown will attract lightning. As a result, the lightning crown has become one of the synonyms of the Prussian M1842 helmet. Of course, Franz will not miss this feast. Although he cannot go out in person, it is still okay to get a vest and post a few negative reviews. Comments within the German Confederation were quite polite, but when it came to the British, they contemptuously called it the devil's horn. The French began to speculate on the use of this helmet, and even the most famous French satirical newspaper Folly publicly solicited possible uses of this helmet from the society, claiming that it would help France become great again. Ever since, all kinds of fantastic ideas have appeared everywhere in French newspapers. For example, you can use the devil's horn to kill the opponent, or use it to open bottle caps, or when setting up a tent, you can have a few soldiers stand upside down to instantly fix it. But in the end, the lightning rod of the German poet got the most votes. The stupid newspaper was going to award the prize of 5,000 francs to this great poet, but it was rejected on the grounds that his inspiration came from His Majesty the Kingdom. So the editor-in-chief of the Folly newspaper mailed the 5,000 franc bonus to Frederick William IV, and the latter actually thought that his design had been recognized by the international community. But when he saw the content of the letter, he wanted to tear it into pieces, but as a king, he could only act like he didn't care. Congratulations, Your Majesty the Great King. Your inspiration has entertained the masses and we would like to express our gratitude to you. The French newspaper Folly pays tribute to you. In fact, the peak design of this helmet was so that the cavalry troops could use it as a stand for wearing feathers and horsehair. This was very common in the army at that time, and could be used for decoration and boosting morale. Second, and most importantly, adding a spire can effectively deflect the stabbing aimed at the head, because in cavalry combat at that time, saber slashing was a routine tactic. Of course, you can't help but mention the Austrian lancers and the American pistol cavalry. Austria Vienna. The Prussian helmet controversy reminded the Austrians that it was time for them to design new helmets. Austrian design must not follow in the footsteps of Prussia. It must be generous, decent, and practical. As a result, there was another quarrel within the Austrian Imperial government. Prince Metternich advocated continuing to use Hungarian-style cloth and leather helmets, and even the felt hats often worn by Hungarian hussars. The advantage of this kind of equipment is that it is beautiful, practical, and cheap, but it has no effect on preventing hacking, and soldiers often fill it with colorful decorations, which affects the overall look and gives the opponent a very unpleasant feeling. Weak, giving ordinary people the feeling of a ragtag army. Count Korolev visited experts in the most famous blacksmith family in Austria to design a helmet for the cavalry of the Austrian Empire. He thought it was the perfect helmet. This helmet is larger and sturdier than the Prussian helmet. It is wrapped with iron plates made of fine leather. It can protect against most slashes, and can even block shotgun attacks at a distance of 50 meters. Their experiment was that the steel balls could not penetrate the helmet. As for what would happen to the head under the helmet, it was not up to them. There is a semicircular slot made of brass on the top of the helmet, which can be used to place a large number of decorations, such as tall feathers tied into a semicircle. In fact, this was the later standard helmet of the Austrian Empire cavalry. In order to keep the military appearance neat, the semicircular decorations on the helmets can be uniformly changed to black and gold, which can better highlight the temperament of the Austrian soldiers and the financial resources of the empire. Point of course, old book friends should know that none of the products produced by Austrians for practical purposes are practical. Point there. Same goes for Count Korolev's helmet, which weighs up to 3.5 kilograms without feathers. What is the concept of 3.5 kilograms? Some people will definitely say that the weight of individual equipment of American soldiers is as high as 53 kilograms. But please understand that this is the 19th century. Moreover, even the high-end tactical helmets used by American special forces usually weigh less than 1.7 kilograms in combat, and the Prussian peaked helmets during the same period weighed only 0.6-0.8 kilograms. The famous M35 during World War II only weighed 1.4 kilograms. This shows how outrageous Count Korolev's helmet was. Of course, he is not entirely concerned about safety and appearance. The price of this kind of helmet is very high, which will involve the interests of many people, including his own. The same goes for Metternich's request to maintain the status quo, because he wants to safeguard the interests of those supporters. Army procurement has always been a hot commodity. Unless it is France, everyone wants to make a huge profit. Regarding the dispute between the two parties, the royal family wanted to see the military's attitude, but in fact the military had no attitude on this matter. Because Count Tyrrell himself had been on the battlefield, he felt that it made no difference whether the cavalry had a helmet or not. It was better to get a breastplate for practical use. After all, there is almost no chance of survival after being shot in the head, and chopping to the head is entirely a Tatar practice, which has long been proven obsolete. Russia once sent Tatar cavalry and Russian infantry to encircle the Hungarian hussars, but the result was that 2,000 hussars easily tore apart the Tatar formation. Later, tens of thousands of Tatar cavalry broke up the ranks of Russian infantry while fleeing, leading to Russia's defeat. Afterwards, the Tsar saw clearly the weak nature of the Tatar cavalry and began a series of annihilation activities. The book returns to its true story. The military had no attitude, so the debate had to be shelved. In fact, it was not until 1848 that the Austrian Empire finally decided to use this helmet after Count Korolev came to power. The design of M35 and even M42 helmets is not difficult to achieve. Because there is not much technical content, France can easily make such a helmet, but the appearance of this helmet is seriously different from the style of the mid-19th century. The sense of dissonance is very serious. Just imagine Napoleon and Wellington, one with an Adrian steel helmet, one with a flying saucer on his head, and then Archduke Karol with a group of hussars carrying M35s. What a scene it would be. The Adrian steel helmet is a famous French steel helmet. The flying saucer refers to the famous British flying saucer helmet Mk1 during World War I, and the M35 is a classic German helmet in World War II. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.